Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel and welcome to my Omnibus series. I've got so many of these omnibuses that are going to come out so that you'll be able to listen to an hour's worth of stories, which I know you're going to love. You know, the thing is that telling stories is such a fine art, and it's something that was practiced hundreds of years ago when people didn't have the technology that we have today. And everyone would gather around the fire and listen to a wonderful story. And also, what is so wonderful about a story is that personally, I think it is the best way to go to sleep. Every night when I go to bed, I always listen to stories. And that's something that parents used to do with their children. It's something that they still do with their children. There's nothing better than a good story. And so I hope you're going to enjoy this series. And before we start, I just want to say, do subscribe to my channel because you don't want to miss out on anything. Because I'm in for the long haul and I want to make sure that you get the most stunning stories to go to bed with at night or to listen to when you want to be one of those people sitting beside the fire and listening. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel and let's get started. I hope you're going to enjoy the omnibus.
Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, I was 10 years old at the time, sitting comfortably on the couch by the crackling fire in my grandfather's cabin in Fairbanks, Alaska. I loved coming to Alaska every year with the family at Christmas time. I grew up in New York, but every year, like clockwork, we would fly into Anchorage International Airport and take the 6.5-hour flight from our home in New York. My father had been raised in Alaska as a boy and had grown up in this idyllic part of the world, so he looked forward to returning home to the sumptuous cosy wooden cabin that he'd grown up in as a boy. He barely tolerated New York, but for my father, Alaska was his real home. Personally, I loved nothing better than seeing my grandparents again, even if I only got to see them once a year. My grandmother had rosy cheeks, fair skin, and a round, cheerful face, with hair as silver as a fox, and she had one of those matronly figures that made you feel all was well with the world. There was something about her solid proportions that was as reassuring to me as the solid girth of a sizable tree. I guess when something is big and burly, it won't break very easily, nor will it fall apart, and I loved my grandmother's stoic, sturdy girth, which accompanied her strength of character, like a matching pair of slippers. My grandfather Felix had hair that was so white it could have competed with the snow and won competitions. He was often asked to pose as Father Christmas in Anchorage, as he boasted a bushy white pair of eyebrows and an impressive long, very substantial white beard. His Arctic blue eyes were so pale that you could almost see through them like a crystal clear blue pool. Despite his advancing years, my grandfather, due to his active, very outdoor lifestyle that demanded great physical exertion, like chopping firewood and other general outdoor pursuits, was remarkably well built, although his endearing, expressive face was weathered by time, as wrinkles like the tributaries of a river had left deep crevices in his skin. At Christmas time, little children would sit on his lap as he sported a bright red Santa Claus outfit, as he was working for one of the stores in Anchorage as Father Christmas. The kids would tell him what they wanted Santa Claus to deliver them for Christmas when he crawled down the chimney and drank the warm milk and chocolate chip cookies they left out for him on Christmas Eve, along with a long red stocking groaning on the mantel with a longing to be filled to overflowing, so that some of the presents spilled out of the stocking, landing on the floor beside the hearth. One of the strangest things a kid ever asked him for was to have big biceps like his dad, and my grandfather told him that he didn't have that gift in his storeroom, that regretfully it was out of stock, to which the boy replied, "Too bad! I want to beat my dad at arm wrestling so I can wipe the cocky smile off his face. My mother says that Daddy's got a cocky smile 'cause he thinks he's all that." "I'm sure one day you will beat your father at arm wrestling," my grandfather told him reassuringly. "Do you think so?" said the little boy, his eyes lighting up like a Christmas tree. "I don't just think so, young man," "I know so," he told the delighted little boy, who skipped away with the biggest grin on his face. He might not beat his dad at arm wrestling this Christmas or the next or the one after that, but one day he surely would, and that thought made him very happy indeed. It was always wonderful spending time in my grandparents' cabin. My nostalgic memories of those idyllic times have long since left an indelible imprint in my heart, and my adult heart aflutter with the sweet memories of a cosy cabin that smelt of cinnamon, cloves, baked ham, and homemade bread. What could be better than that? And so it was on this late, bitterly cold winter afternoon, when the sun was slipping away, like an exhausted house guest who wanted to make a quick retreat. The darkness soon rolled in, but the sun left behind a few of her glamorous footprints on the horizon, in a kaleidoscope of golds, tangerines, and pinks, which made this idyllic winter wonderland outside the window look even more beguiling, as the reflectant, shimmering light over the valley swathed everything in a gossamer golden infusion that would be the panoramic delight of any aspiring artist to splash onto a canvas. It was these marvellous sunsets that Alaska is so famous for that would steal my young breath away. And then, of course, not to be forgotten, the Northern Lights displays that were seen at night, which were another beguiling mystery that had always enchanted my young mind, as the swooping folds of moving light over the horizon gave the world a mysterious quality that invited many Alaskans to believe in the legends that abounded around cosy fires, where enigmatic cryptic creatures were regularly discussed, and the whereabouts of missing people that disappeared in the Alaskan Triangle year after year. It was the day before Christmas Eve. A blizzard beat against the eaves of my grandfather's cabin, so that it rattled and shook precariously, as if the cabin was shaking its wooden coat like a shaggy dog after a quick dip in the water. I would stare in awe out of my grandfather's windows at an exquisite white wilderness stretched out before me like an all-encompassing yawn, where everything around us was swathed in carpets of thick, velvety, beautiful snow, and I could see the top layer of this frosty, ethereal white sheet being galvanized and whipped up from its resting place, as a cantankerous blizzard of wind and snow thrashed through the trees, beating rudely against the eaves of the cabin, almost as if it was an angry axe murderer standing outside our front door, hell-bent on unleashing his wrath upon us, and pounding at the doors and windows with an unrelenting, loud, rapping sound. I would observe the tall, lofty silhouettes of the alpine trees, with their needled boughs almost shuddering and quaking against this rambunctious, rather reckless onslaught. In my humble opinion, as a watchful observer, it seemed that the weather had a mind of its own, and decided to be as pugnaciously capricious as a rebellious teenager, hell-bent on having a temper tantrum that could not be subdued, and there was not a jot you could actually do about it. My grandmother used to say that the weather was just having a bad hair day, which I thought was a good way to put it. I was very contented to remain cushioned by the comforts of the cosy cabin that enveloped us in its warm, welcoming, reassuring boughs, like a silken cocoon, and what went on outside our four walls didn't matter, as inside the cabin we were blissfully insulated against the Arctic blizzards and breezes, which were far from benign, for when you went out in that unforgiving weather, you were thrown around like a feather in the wind. My grandfather was an incredible storyteller. He was a pure-bred Alaskan, as generations of his family had survived the chilly conditions that the Alaskan wilderness bestowed on its citizens seasonally. As a result of years of tackling the cruel, unyielding elements that bit through bone, marrow, and sinew without apology, my grandfather and father were both hardened, robust Alaskan men that were pretty much not afraid of anything. On this occasion a cheerful fire was dancing away merrily in the hearth, and we had just eaten a hearty meal of stewed beef and dumplings in a rich red wine gravy. Somewhere in the background we could hear Michael Jackson singing a Christmas carol. I think it was Rocking Around the Christmas Tree or something as ebullient as that, which made all of us naturally jive to the music. My grandfather pulled out his pipe, as me and my two brothers, Colton and Matt, were sitting by the fire, eyes pinned on my grandfather, our hearts eagerly anticipating the promise of a very good story. I loved to see my grandfather fill up his pipe with tobacco, lighting it up. He'd suck in a breath and blow out clouds of white smoke, and the pleasing smell of his cigar would infuse very tunefully with the fragrant Christmas smells of cinnamon and clove, mingling with the pleasant wood smoke of the fire. The smells of the firewood would always differ, depending on the wood you were burning, but the smell was always remarkably good. "So you're going to tell us a story, are you, Grandpa Felix?" I asked him. My grandfather would suck again in his pipe, drawing in that aromatic smoke. I would watch him in fascination, as white pillows of smoke wafted around the room like a ghost, merging into the wooden walls of the cabin, until they were all but gone. The fire would crackle and pop. Flames danced over the wood that my grandfather had recently chopped. Me and my brothers were wearing our PJs and were snugly wrapped up in my grandmother's crochet woolen blankets as we huddled around the toasty warm fire, waiting for my grandfather to speak. "Ah, a story. Is that what you would like?" "Yes, please! Yes, please!" I would say. My grandmother would be crocheting something vigorously with her thick, veiny fingers, and would roll her eyes in the back of her head. "Of course they want a story, Felix. Why on earth do you think they're all looking at you like that?" My father and mother had retired to bed, exhausted after a day spent Christmas shopping in Anchorage. "Very well," said my grandfather, releasing a heavy sigh. "You want a story? I'll tell you a good one. How about I tell you about the hellhound? He's a harbinger of death. Have you heard of the hellhound before?" Me and my brothers shook our heads vigorously. "No, we haven't. What is the harbinger of death, Grandpa Felix?" I asked. My grandfather's voice lowered to quite a whisper. His eyes looked furtively around the cabin, almost as if an outer-worldly impostor were surreptitiously tuning in to our conversation. "They say that when you witness a hellhound crossing your path, it's a warning of an impending death. People who claim to have seen the hellhound have affirmed that shortly after an encounter with such a beast, someone they loved or was very close to them died. It is not a legend, it is true." My grandmother winced rather uncomfortably in her chair. "Must you talk about such insidious things, Felix?" she grumbled. "Do you want to give our grandchildren nightmares? It's Christmas, for goodness sake. Can't you talk about something more cheerful, perhaps?" Both my brothers' eyes brightened, growing wide with eager anticipation. "We want to hear about the hellhound, Grandpa Felix," my brother Matt insisted. "Everybody knows scary stories are very cool." "I thought as much. I thought you'd like to hear about the hellhound," said my grandfather. "You see, here in Alaska, there are things out there in that vast, sprawling wilderness of ours that you can only imagine. And one of those things is the hellhound, and many have seen it before someone they love dies. He appears almost as a warning." "Have you seen the hellhound, Grandpa Felix?" I asked, my eyes now as wide as my brother's, my little heart fluttering with excited anticipation. For some inexplicable reason, I always found scary stories oddly soothing, maybe because I felt safe in the cabin. So safe that a scary story was just that, just a story that could not possibly touch my own life. How wrong I was about that. "I have indeed," my grandfather told us, his eyes narrowing. "When I was a young boy here in Alaska, to be fair, I was older than you, but you must remember, at my age, I'm an old man now, 16 for me is very, very young. Me and my dad, we were driving back from Anchorage. The weather had been incredibly cold and had dipped significantly, so it had been a long time for us to heat up our engine. We wanted to get back to my father's cabin before the darkness rolled in, but the roads were exceedingly treacherous, despite our tires that were conditioned for driving in these perilous, unforgiving conditions. Our journey was rather tumultuous, to say the least. It was getting dark very quickly. I remember my grandfather's words were, "Damn, damn, damn, I shouldn't have let Betty McCrocklin gas on for so long. Every time you run into that insufferable, irritating woman, she garrulously talks and talks. She can talk the underpants of an old man, so that you could never, ever get away." I do remember she had been talking to my grandfather about some wedding she'd been to, going into explicit detail about what the bridesmaids were wearing that day. In between discussions of chiffon and lace, my grandfather finally had enough. He said, "It's lovely to see you, Betty, but I must make tracks." He was rather curt, but there was no other way to get rid of the woman. Thanks to her, our shopping trip had been delayed, and we were getting back home in ice-cold conditions, under the cover of darkness. It was more than a little intimidating, let me tell you. As we were driving along, my father was paying great attention to the road. The light of our headlights lit up the sequestered snow-covered road ahead of us. Soon we were getting close to our cabin, and that was when we observed a monstrous canine creature that stepped out into the middle of the road, just like that, with a purposeful intent. It turned around to face us, and stared at us with bright yellow eyes that were as large as teacups. This dog was blacker than the night. It was massive, and it almost stared right through us. I've never been so afraid in my entire life, let me tell you. This creature sent chills down my spine. The next thing it did was it opened its wide jaws to expose its canine teeth, and it let out a loud howl. It was the most frightful sound that I have ever heard. My grandfather, who was sitting at the wheel, was shaking like a leaf. I remember there was something so outer-worldly about this dog. Oh, my word, I've never seen anything like it before or since, but it sent shivers down my spine. For several minutes the insidious canine creature locked eyes with us, and then it turned around and just sauntered away. It took a while for my grandfather to calm down and compose himself. For a moment he could barely drive, he was shaking so much. But we finally managed to return back to the cabin. When we got home, my grandfather told me that my very best friend Corey had gone missing. The next day they discovered his limp body dangling from a tree. They had no idea who had killed him or why he had vanished from his home. I believe the hellhound was warning me of his death. Corey was to my family like a son, and to me a brother. His death completely devastated our family. It took me a long time to get over his tragic loss. When my grandfather told me this story, I was completely baffled by it. Was the hellhound a supernatural beast that gave you a warning of an imminent death, that would cross the threshold of your life and cause devastation? It would certainly seem so. I remember shuddering as I crossed my fingers and toes, hoping with all my heart that I would never ever encounter such a bodeful creature like this. But my hopes would be dashed many years later, when I was a fully grown adult, living in Fairbanks, Alaska, with my husband Michael and my little 6-year-old son Robin. It was on one innocent summer night me and my husband encountered the beast on a late-night drive home from Anchorage. I knew from what my grandfather had told me that I had seen the hellhound. I was married at that time to my Alaskan husband Michael, whom I met when I was 18 years old. After a brief introduction from my grandfather Felix at Christmas when I stayed at his cabin, for the two of us it had been quite literally love at first sight, In the beginning I had no thoughts of ever leaving this idyllic part of the world that I loved so much, like my father had done. It had got firmly anchored under my skin, in a positive way. It was such a pleasingly pleasant summer night. We had enjoyed a fabulous birthday celebration. We were meant to stay overnight in Anchorage, but there had been a mix-up in the booking arrangements, and my girlfriend had accidentally booked a single room for us instead of a double. It was then that my husband, on seeing the pitiful bed in the room, said, "Let's make tracks home, shall we? This room is far too dingy, far too small for the two of us." I had agreed, as I didn't like the thought of spending a night in such a miserably small bedroom, despite the fact that it was well presented and very comfortable. It was way too small for us to enjoy a reasonable night's sleep. There were no double rooms available for us. The place was fully booked. The journey home had been pretty plain sailing. We were not facing tumultuous obstacles of driving in treacherous icy conditions, but it was exceedingly dark on the roads. My husband was not intimidated by such things. I closed my eyes on the front seat as my husband's car rattled down the meandering, rather bumpy road, and all of a sudden I heard him gasp. Something very big was sitting on its haunches in the middle of the road. "What the hell is that?" said my husband, slamming his foot very fast on the brakes. My eyelids fluttered open, and I looked out of the windscreen window. Puddles of soft moonlight spilt on the middle of the road, dancing over a very solid, sizable canine silhouette. "What the hell is that?" I gasped, staring out of the window with a bemused expression on my face. My husband pressed his hand on the horn, because he needed the creature to clear the road, for it was blocking our way. It was such an airy feeling, for there was something not quite right about this thing, which gripped me with a profound sense of uneasiness. The figure turned around to face us, swivelling its body directly towards us. It seemed to be undaunted by my impatient husband slamming on the horn. "What the hell is that?" I gasped, my eyes narrowing into an awkward squint, as I studied the strange, very obscure, dense silhouette sitting in the middle of the road. My husband pressed his hand on the horn. He needed the creature to clear our path, for it was blocking our way. It was such an airy feeling, for there was something not quite right about this thing, which gripped me with a profound sense of uneasiness. This ambiguous, dense, dark silhouette swivelled its body around directly to face us. It seemed to be undaunted by my impatient husband slamming on the horn. That was when we saw the creature so much more clearly. We both audibly gasped. I think the first words that came out of my husband's mouth were, "Bloody hell! What on earth is that?" We were staring at a huge canine creature, who was staring at us with very intimidating yellow eyes. It opened its jaws and let out a disembodied wail that sent chills down my spine, and the hairs on my arms standing up on end. I began to shake violently, like a child's rattle. I don't recall a time when I'd been so afraid. The creature trotted away nonchalantly, just slipping silently into the shadows, until we could see through the boughs of the trees those haunting yellow eyes still staring at us. "Go!" I cried out to my husband. "Go! Please go, Michael!" The car jolted and juddered as the exhausted engine spluttered into life, and we hurried back to our cabin. I was now trembling in my boots. We had definitely seen the hellhound. I told my husband, "Someone is about to die. We've just seen the hellhound. That's a harbinger of death. Don't you know about the hellhound? My grandfather told me about it when I was a little girl. I know that that is what we've seen. Someone we love is going to die." My first thoughts were to phone my parents at once, and then to check up on my little son, who'd been staying the weekend with my husband's mother. Was something bad going to happen to him? My husband chuckled and told me, "Don't be so superstitious. Yes, we've seen a very strange creature tonight. Granted, I've never seen something like that before. It scared the bejesus out of me. But that can't be a hellhound, surely not. And even if it was, nothing bad is going to happen to us." But he was so wrong, for what unfolded the next day is only what a mother's nightmares are made of. 11 years later, I waited in trepidation as the aircraft tipped to begin its descent, my nose nuzzling the porthole window, blemishing it with the misty contours of its straight definition. Everything was so green. The sky was as blue as a field of cornflowers. At first it was sprawling green, undulating wilderness that stretched out before me, the alpine fields, the smouldering mountains that all came into view. I saw the pencil-thin grey lines of motorways, the matchbox-like buildings of a town, where buildings were clustered together in a large square, and there were parking lots where several cars were stacked together in neat straight rows. I saw the meandering loops of a river, and the aqua blue-like water of a reservoir of some kind. My journey was almost over, and had almost come to its end. I knew that Michael Rodriguez was down there waiting for me somewhere. The last time I'd spoken to my ex-husband was over 11 years ago. I was returning to familiar territory that I had once called home, the Alaska I knew and loved. Only now this familiar territory was as alien to me as the skin on my back. I was feeling flustered about seeing Michael again, and had hoped our paths would never cross for as long as I lived. But it would seem circumstances were inadvertently pulling us together again, like a tight elastic band on a pair of jogging shorts. When I walked out on my ex-husband, I told him that I wished he and his mother were both dead, and I had watched how my ex-husband had broken down, begged me not to be so rash, not to leave him, but I had walked out of our beloved wooden cabin, with a heart as hard as stone, and blood so cold and so cruel it could freeze a fallen autumn leaf, turning it into a fossil almost immediately. I wondered what me and my ex-husband could have in common now, after all these long years of separation, where we were both mere shadows of the people we once had been, mere echoes of a time when our lives were abundant with the joy and bright wistful promises we believed our futures would hold for us. But our dreams had been shattered, like a glass crystal vase that breaks into hundreds of glass shards that you can never ever put back together again, no matter how much you try, or a squashed piece of papaya under a pair of heavy walking boots. Now me and my ex-husband were both dried up, like dead grass, begging to be renewed again, like a barren wilderness, hungry for the first rains to fall. I knew nothing about my ex-husband's life, and I'm quite sure he knew little of mine. He knew, of course, I'd moved to New York, where I was sharing a flat with a girlfriend of mine in Manhattan, but he probably did not know I had become a nurse at the New York Presbyterian Hospital. He might have guessed I'd returned to nursing. That would only be a guess on his part. People's lives can change dramatically, especially after a fortuitous tragic event, as it likely had also done for him. I'm quite sure his life had also been involuntarily shifted off its axis, as if his entire world had been obliterated by a random meteor that neither of us saw coming, even though the hellhound clearly did. After our son had died so tragically, I had made it the most important thing in my life to keep his memory vibrantly alive, and it was the image of his smiling face that enabled me to sail through each day, even if it was over rocky, tumultuous waters. My grief today was as bad and as raw as it had been on the first time I had learnt of my son's fortuitous passing. And who was responsible for his death? It was, of course, Michael's mother, June Rodriguez, who I fully blamed for the accident, and by association I saw my ex-husband Michael as being equally as culpable. So many people told me I was being unreasonable, including my own parents. It was a tragic accident, but in my eyes everything was clear-cut and as plainly obvious as staring through a plain glass window without any ambiguous obstacles blocking my view. It was my husband's mother, June, whom had insisted on buying our son Robin a skateboard for his 6th birthday. My son Robin had literally begged and pleaded me to buy him a skateboard. I had put my foot down, telling him I was not comfortable about him riding a skateboard. But this was the problem with my mother-in-law, June, who was determined to pander to my son's every whim, not realizing that sometimes you need to be cruel to be kind, for the best interests of your child. If he wanted a skateboard, she'd buckle under his bequests like a camping chair, that folds in on itself. I'd felt so indignant when on my son's birthday he had cried out with enthusiasm when he'd unwrapped his grandmother's oversized, extravagant present, which, based on its appearances, looked suspiciously like a skateboard. I remember my heart sank, like a heavy stone being thrust into a large body of water. I didn't have a good feeling about this, as I watched my son's tiny little hands zealously breaking through the folds of wrapping paper, and the broad grin that burst out on his angelic little face. "Grandma June, this is the best present that I've ever received in my entire life. Thank you so much." My son had rushed into his grandmother June's arms like an ebullient gust of wind, almost knocking the fragile figure of Grandma June right over. She had always been a very small, petite woman, standing up proudly at about 4 foot. She'd sit on several cushions to see over the steering wheel when she drove. But even though she was tiny, that woman was larger than life when it came to her personality. June Rodriguez had looked as pleased as Punch in that moment that she had presented my son Robin with his present. I wanted to box her ears as hard as I could. I could feel the annoyed indignance seeping out of every pore in my body. My husband, on sensing my internal turmoil, gave me a sympathetic nod, and then he said, "Thanks, Mum. I can see Michael is thrilled with the present. It's very generous of you. What a kind thing of you to do. You shouldn't have." He made all the right murmurings to appease his mother. Why did he not insist she return the skateboard to the shop? He knew how I felt about skateboards. Working as a nurse, I'd certainly seen my fair share of skateboard accidents, 2 of which had been fatal. So my feelings over this innocent, benign-looking board were more than a little frenzied. I was burning with fury. How dare his mother buy our son a skateboard, when I pacifically insisted that he was not ready to use one yet? But my mother-in-law had failed to listen to me. I guess a skateboard in a wild, rugged wilderness like Alaska seemed very benevolent and benign, but not to me it wasn't. My mother-in-law, June, would conveniently go mute when she didn't like what we were discussing. I remember she claimed once that her ears were terribly small, which was why she didn't hear everything that we were talking about. Petite she might have been, but there was nothing unnaturally small about her ears. At 6 years old, Robin was clumsy and ungainly on his feet, and wasn't coordinated enough to use a skateboard. But June had a mind of her own, and was stubbornly determined to bend all the rules just to get her way. Her eyes wavered over me, and sensing my angst, she at least had the decency to look a little bashful. "I just couldn't help myself," she said, with an apologetic twinkle in the eye. "I knew that Robin wanted a skateboard, and when I saw it, it was so perfect for him. But don't you worry, I've got him safety gear as well, a hat and some knee pads. I'll make sure that he keeps the skateboard at my home, and only uses it at my cabin when he comes to stay with me." If June thought my mind had been eased by her persuasions, she couldn't have been more wrong. I remember an ominous feeling washed over me that made my stomach muscles inwardly clench. My teeth began to rattle as a sense of foreboding overcame me, and then a small squeaky voice came out of my throat that I barely recognized as my own. "He needs to be supervised, June, at all times on that skateboard. Do you understand?" "But of course, my dear. I won't let my grandson out of my sight." So much for her famous last words. I knew that June could get very distracted. It was the weekend of my friend's birthday party in Anchorage that my son was in the charge of his grandmother June. And on our return trip home, me and my husband encountered the hellhound on the road. That was when I had a dreadful feeling that something very bad was about to happen. And at 10 o'clock the following morning, my worst fears were confirmed. My 6-year-old son was dead, and it was June Rodriguez's fault, along with that damned skateboard. I was never fully aware how the accident had happened, and all these years later, I didn't want to know the grisly details. I had learnt something about my son's skateboard throwing him into a tree when he was not wearing his helmet, and beyond that my mind is a blank. but I shut out the details, as there are some things you just don't want to hear. I remember what the doctors had said to me about his brain injury, but I remember shutting down after that. I do, of course, remember telling June Rodriguez that it was all her fault, and beyond that my cutting words abandoned me, along with the cruel memories of a day I refused to remember, for in truth it was all but a blank, as if I had purposely pulled a veil of amnesia over that bitter, cruel time in my life. My therapist assured me that that was a natural thing to do. This is what happened when we try to overcome traumatic events in our lives, and that is our way of trying to heal. So as I sat back in the plane, I saw the shadow of our plane swoop, as it lowered itself when the airport terminal came into view. Then I heard the jolt of our landing gear, as the wheels unrolled beneath the plane, until they smacked the tarmac beneath them. Then there was a familiar jolting bump, as the plane touched down. The air brakes groaned, and the wheels under the plane speedily rolled forward like a trolley in the supermarket. The anxious young man sitting next to me was terrified of flying. He had been holding the chair so tightly as the plane descended that the whites of his knuckles peered through his skin, and every second utterance that came out of his mouth was, "Oh my God! Oh my God! Oh my God! Oh my God!" The young man let out a spasm of relief. Now we finally had settled on terra firma, and the chances of having an accident were extinguished. The young man grabbed my arm, nudging me tightly. "Oh my God! We've landed safely! We did it! We did it! We're safe now! I can't believe it! We're safe!" I inwardly squirmed. It was all over now for him. His anxiety was over, but for me, my anxieties were only beginning. And as I thought of Michael Rodriguez waiting for me at the arrivals hall, I became increasingly panicky. My heart began to flap, as if thousands of pigeons had taken off into the sky at the same time inside me. My skin had become clammy, and I could swear a feeling of heat had trespassed across my face, like a hot fever. It was all too late now. I was here in Alaska, and who had brought me here? That damned ex-mother-in-law of mine, who even in death was causing issues from beyond the grave, by meddling and interfering in my life. She thought she was so clever, getting us together again like this. She had been bugging me for years, begging me to return to Alaska. "You and Michael are soulmates. He is broken without you. You need to come together." I had refused to listen to her, ignored her pleading requests, but now here I was, back in Alaska. When the solicitor, Mr. Saxon, had phoned me for the reading of the will, it was of course on June's insistence that I should be present with my ex-husband at the reading. Of course I could have refused to come to Alaska, but that would be turning my back on a sizable amount of money that I could not afford to turn down. I had a bank loan that I was paying off. My finances were in disarray. Living in New York had been hellishly expensive for me, and I was living above my means, even though my lifestyle was incredibly modest. "Miss Battersby, you really would be wise to come to the reading of the will. I'll make sure I drop in on you during the first week of June at your ex-husband's cabin for the reading. You'll need to stay there for at least a week, I'm afraid. I'm inundated with so much work, and being Alaska, I can't give you an exact time or date when I will be there, but I will make sure it's the first week. It's in your interest to come. If you fail to be there for the reading, I'm afraid you will forfeit your opportunity of inheriting a sizable amount of money from June Rodriguez. She was a very wealthy woman, you know. It would be a pity to turn that all away because of your pride." I had been shocked that the solicitor, Mr. Saxon, had not been shy to express his thoughts in regards to the matter. It was clear he had an opinion that he didn't mind expressing. I perceived he believed my thoughtless abandonment of my husband had been completely unreasonable and irrational. But he had never lost a child before, had he? What did he know what that felt like, when your whole world comes crumbling down in your lap, and there is nothing left behind? Losing a child was the most traumatic thing that could happen to me. And if he thought I was being calculating and cold in blaming my ex-mother-in-law for my son's fortuitous passing, that was his problem, not mine. You would think as a nurse I'd be more forgiving and compassionate, as after all death was not alien to me, for at the New York Presbyterian Hospital I had encountered it more times than I care to remember. But when it comes to losing your son prematurely, it's a whole nother ballgame.
Miss Battersby, I hope I don't speak out of term here, but I realize you have not seen your ex-husband in a long time. But isn't it time you put your differences behind you?
Came the solicitor's patronizing voice. I wanted to shout down the phone to Mr. Saxon to tell him to mind his own bloody business. He continued,
Now I fully appreciate what happened to your son. Was a tragic, very fortuitous accident that no one saw coming. Very often marriages fail after parents lose a child together. The pain is so insurmountable, you see. It tears away at the glue of their relationship that held them together. June Rodriguez, whom I knew very well, she was a very good friend of mine, your mother-in-law, blamed herself for breaking up your marriage because of the untimely death of your son. But I would like to remind you, it was a dreadful accident.
I wanted to shriek down the phone to Mr. Saxon to tell him to stop interfering in my life, and to remind him that actually the accident would never have transpired if Mrs. Rodriguez had not brought my son the skateboard in the first place. Where was she when he was messing around outside on his board, rolling down that treacherous asphalt driveway? Oh no, she wasn't anywhere even close to him. The negligent June Rodriguez was sauntering around her kitchen as if butter wouldn't melt in her mouth, making cookies, oblivious to what my son was getting up to on his skateboard outside. So much for supervising my son, like she'd promised to do.
Miss Battersby, are you still there? Came the solicitor's voice.
Yes, Mr. Saxon, I'm here, I said, biting my lip awkwardly.
As I was saying, Miss Battersby, you would be a fool to turn down this kind of money. I would advise you to come to the reading of the will. Don't be a fool. Don't be too proud to turn down this kind of money.
Don't you worry, Mr. Saxon. I will be there. I need the money.
I thought as much,
said Mr. Saxon, sounding extremely satisfied. I could swear he was almost rubbing his hands with glee.
You've made a very wise, sagacious decision, Miss Battersby. I will pop around to the cabin one day during the first week of June. I'll be seeing you then.
When the phone call had ended, I mumbled under my breath, It's not like I've got any choice in the matter. I had borrowed money from my friends, got myself into numerous financial pickles, and so a payout from an inheritance would be a welcome relief. So now here I was in Alaska. The plane had come to a standstill. People were hurriedly rising out of their seats, reaching for their luggage in the holdalls. Some people were marching down the aisle, in a desperate hurry to disembark, clearly over-enthusiastic to leave the aircraft. But I was very happy to steadily take my time. I was in no rush to see Michael Rodriguez again. I could smell the strong stench of aircraft fuel, and with my large bag slung over my shoulders, I exited the stairs and could feel the warm sunshine brushing snugly against my shoulders and nudging my cheeks. It was a magnificently beautiful day. Of that there was no doubt. Soon we were shepherded across the tarmac. I found myself stuck behind a family where the two twins, a girl and a boy, looked as if they were Robin's age when he lost his life. Every time I saw 6-year-old children, it would make a huge knot develop in my stomach, as an overwhelming sense of sorrow would consume me. I was naturally elated for these parents to have such magnificent children, but it compounded the emptiness of my own grief, always reminding me of what I'd lost all those years ago. My little boy would now be 17 years old by now. Don't go there, I reminded myself. Let it go. For goodness sake, let it go. I had been telling myself that for years, but I was still haunted by the memory of my beloved precious son. I clung on to the recall of my son like a lifeboat out at sea, terrified of letting go, lest I should forget him. I did not want to forget my son, but with the passing of time, much of my recollections of those happier times were becoming ambiguously vague and were beginning to dwindle. I reached the terminal building and walked through the open glass sliding doors. I shuffled across a marble floor to hear the trill of my cell phone in my purse. I stopped short in my tracks and pulled it out of its leather confinement. There was a text message from Michael on my cell, claiming he was waiting for me in the arrivals hall. The brusque message was so cold and insouciant. Nothing about how he was looking forward to seeing me again after so many years, or how he hoped I'd had a nice flight. But then again, what did I expect? After I had left Alaska, I'd heard from my sister-in-law Sophie about the sorry state of my husband. She had told me not to turn my back on Michael. "He loves you, Sam, and you're just turning your back on him. You can't do this to him. Your son's accident was not his fault." Her words were now ramming into my head like a jackhammer drill. It wasn't his fault. It wasn't his fault. I knew underneath the layers of my denial that Sophie was right, but admitting that it was true was not something that would ever come easily to me. It had been easy to hate June and Michael Rodriguez, and I had found holding on to my grief far less challenging when there was somebody else to blame. I knew that my husband had never remarried, that during the winter he took tourists on sledge rides in Alaska, and during the summer on horse riding trails. My heart was thumping, my breathing ragged, when I arrived at the luggage carousel. In the past, when I waited for my luggage, my suitcase would have always been one of the last on the conveyor belt, but not today. My bright yellow suitcase with its purple locks was distinctive, along with my printed name spread across the suitcase in bold capital letters, Sam. It now came rolling down the carousel. I reluctantly pulled it off the conveyor belt, found a trolley, threw it on the trolley, and made my way to arrivals. As I approached the exit gate, I began to twitch nervously, but I straightened my back, and with a bold mock confidence I walked through the doors, holding my breath and trying to fight back the anxiety that was bubbling up inside me. Through narrowed eyes I squinted in the bright light of the arrivals hall, looking for Michael Rodriguez, but I did not see him. Where was he? That was when I noticed a man with silvery hair, wearing long navy blue chinos and a white golfing shirt, waving at me. Why was this strange man waving at me? Who was he? When I observed him more closely, I realized the man with the silvery hair was in fact my ex-husband. He had changed so much over the years. His black hair had become silver. I guess I was expecting him to look the way I'd remembered him last. I walked towards him rather reluctantly, my cheeks flushing bright red with embarrassment. I suddenly felt conspicuously small, very self-conscious. What would I say when I finally greeted him? The apathetic expression on his face was clear to read. He didn't want to be here any more than I did. He would prefer to have open heart surgery than be here at the airport with me. "Hi there," came Michael's uninspired voice. "Let me help you with all that luggage," he said gingerly. He didn't smile when he greeted me. He took my trolley from me, and his eyes refused to meet mine. Instead, he marched ahead of me, rolling the trolley in his hands, with me scuttling behind him, like a tiny little dog, trying to keep up with a big Labrador. This was going to be more than a tad awkward. What on earth were we going to say to each other on the journey to Fairbanks? The two of us were like perfect strangers who didn't know each other at all. Michael threw my suitcase into the trunk. Then he opened the door for me, and even when I sat there next to him in the front seat of his SUV, my fingers were clammy, my heart pounding in my chest, as the cloying silence stretched out between us, and I knew that this was not a good nor promising start. How would we get through the coming days at the cabin, when we barely acknowledged each other? Michael reached out to put on the car radio, so that the silence between us was less stinging. In the end, I could bear it no more. "Michael, I'm sorry to hear about June's death. I really am." Michael steadily focused on the road ahead. For a while he said nothing. I could see the whites of his knuckles, as his fingers were clenched so tightly on the steering wheel. I could swear that Michael's jaw had almost stiffened.
Really? He said, with a note of sarcasm in his voice. You do surprise me. Why would you say that? You didn't give a damn about my mother. You always blamed her for Robin's death.
I grimaced. I know, I said in a little whisper. I'm sorry about that. Genuinely, I really am sorry that she died. It's not easy to lose a mother. It must have been very hard for you and for your sister. I'm especially sorry, that she died.
Thanks, said Michael curtly, glancing at me briefly through suspicious, narrowing eyes. My mother was never the same after Robin died. She never forgave herself for what happened. So I think over the years she got far too frisky with the alcohol. You do know she died of cirrhosis of the liver. Drinking far too much. Drinking the pain away, I imagine. It's a big problem here in Alaska. Overindulgence in alcohol.
I'm so sorry to hear that. I had no idea, I said flatly. How have you been? I asked obsequiously, wishing to God I hadn't asked the question, but it had just tumbled out of my mouth, and I was desperate to try to fill the bleak, miserable silence.
How do you think I've been? My ex-husband snapped. I've been better. You could say when things in my life were actually working. After Robin died, I was never the same again. And when you bogged off into the sunset, it was very hard for me.
I bit my lip awkwardly. I'm sorry. I was broken. You know I was. We were all hurting.
Don't you think me and my mother were broken? Don't you think we were hurting too? No, it was all about you, wasn't it? You didn't give a damn about anyone. You sauntered off to New York. The next thing I know is I've got divorce papers in the post. You didn't even bother to discuss anything with me. As far as you were concerned, it was over between us. It was me and my mother's fault that Robin died, and you blamed us for it.
But it was your mother's fault. She knew how I felt about skateboards. I told her not to buy a skateboard for Robin, because I knew of 2 children who had died on skateboards. Our child was only 6 years old, for God's sake, but she still insisted on buying him that skateboard, I said, tears spilling down my cheeks that I hurriedly wiped away with the back of my arm. I told your mother not to buy a skateboard, but would she listen? Oh, no, she wouldn't. So much for the safety gear she brought our son. He wasn't even wearing a helmet when he died. If he'd had his helmet on, none of this would have happened.
Look at you, Sam. It's so typical. You're playing the blame game again. Don't you think my mother went through hell, tormenting herself about what had happened? She did tell our son to use his helmet, but he was the one that didn't listen on that day. I'm not sure why, but it is what it is.
She should have supervised him. She promised she would, I said, my voice becoming croaky. Instead, she was cooking cookies in the kitchen, while our son went colliding into a tree. My ex-husband grimaced. His square jawline almost jiggled in indignation.
I think we should stay clear of this subject, he said. It's very distressing. We need to move on. All this happened over 11 years ago, for God's sake. I don't want to keep living in the past. What's the point? It only makes us miserable.
Move on. That's what everybody's been telling me to do for years and years. How do I ever move on?
You have to move on, for God's sake, Sam, said Michael. If you don't, you'll destroy yourself. Look at you. It's been 11 years, for God's sake. You look as if it was yesterday when you were hit by a forklift truck. You need to get a grip, woman, or you'll be heading for an early grave, just like my mother. I'm sure you don't want that for yourself. I'm sick of seeing the people I love destroying themselves. We are going to be living in my cabin, our family home, for the next 7 days, and I would like to think we can at least make an effort to get along. Until Mr. Saxon reads us the contents of my mother's will. My mother was determined to leave you a sizable chunk of money, by way of apology for what had happened.
But she was still determined to bring us together after all this time, I said scathingly. She's trying to play matchmaker from beyond the grave. It's pathetic.
I think we both know it's too late for that, said Michael gingerly. It's water under the bridge now. When you bogged off the way you did to New York, I realized how cold and heartless, vindictive, spiteful, self-centered you really are. It was a good thing I wasn't saddled with you for the rest of my life. I'd have been as miserable as hell stuck with you," he said, with a resentful bitterness in his voice.
Michael's obdurate words really stung me. Is that the way he thought about me? That I was cold, inconsiderate and heartless? Due to the fact that I'd walked away from our marriage so many years ago? I was surprised to find that I actually cared about his opinion of me. And what he just said made me feel as if I'd been squeezed very hard like a lemon, so that there was nothing left inside me but a bitter, very cloying aftertaste that was hard to digest. In that moment I so wished I had done everything differently. I saw myself suddenly through Michael's eyes, and realized in horror how stony-hearted, insensitive, ruthlessly cold-blooded I had been, only considering my own grief, and sparing no thought or compassion for anybody else beyond myself, as if I was the only one suffering from Robin's death. I had cushioned myself away in my grief, and stopped anyone who loved me from getting close. No wonder Michael despised me. We sat there in the thorny, indelicate silence, with a 6-hour drive still ahead of us to Fairbanks. We would regularly drive from Anchorage to Fairbanks in the good old days, as if it was nothing, but I thought that in this uncongenial silence the drive would feel so much longer. It was Michael who suddenly broke the awkwardness between us.
"You know, the night before my mother died, I saw the hellhound again. Remember we saw it the night before our son died?"
"You saw the hellhound again?" I gasped. I had avoided any real eye contact with my ex-husband until now, until the ominous words spilled out of Michael's mouth. I found myself staring at him. For a brief second our eyes met, and I felt my heart quicken its beat. I could feel that I was still drawn to my ex-husband, even after all these years, when I had been so determined to hate him. But right now, I didn't hate him at all.
"Yeah, I was in Anchorage at the time, buying supplies, would you believe it? Someone slashed all 4 of my tires."
"They what? Why would they do that?" I asked.
"Well, you know, I found out later," said Michael, "that a young lady whose boyfriend had cheated on her, after drinking too much alcohol, was so enraged with him, she slashed his tires in revenge. Well, she thought they were his, but she inadvertently slashed the wrong tires. Turns out her boyfriend drives exactly the same SUV as I do."
"That is ridiculous. Didn't it occur to the woman to check the number plates before she just slashed someone's tires so randomly?"
"Well, you know, common sense does fly out of the window when you're as mad as a hatter," said Michael, chuckling. "Needless to say, I had to get 4 new tires fitted on my car, so I wasn't going anywhere very fast. Then I had the 6.5-hour trip to Fairbanks ahead of me, so it was getting ominously dark. And there I was, driving back on a sequestered country road. So I saw the hellhound sitting in the middle of the road, and I knew at once what I was seeing, and every cell in my body was infiltrated by an impending dread. My life had already spun out of control the last time I saw this hellhound, and just when I was getting my life on track, I was seeing it all over again."
"You're bloody joking! It's terrible!"
"No, I'm not. I wish I was."
"What happened?"
Michael drew in a deep breath. "Well, it was not unsimilar to the experience we had, really. The hellhound turned around. His yellow eyes met mine. For a moment I was locked in his gaze. He then opened his jaw and howled like a wolf, and then he walked past me on the road with a nonchalant, indifferent gait. I don't mind admitting I was trembling in my boots. I hurriedly drove away, my whole SUV rattling in indignation as I sped down the bumpy road. 5 minutes later my cell phone was ringing. My mother's next-door neighbour told me she'd popped over to see my mother, found her lying dead in her armchair, with a bottle of whiskey lying spilled across the floor. I drew up to the side of the road, and I sobbed my heart out.
"I'm so sorry, Michael," I said obsequiously. I don't know what to say. This hellhound really is a harbinger of death. Why is it that not everyone sees the hound before someone dies? Why did it focus its attentions on us? First my grandfather saw it, then you and I saw it, and now you've seen it again. I'm sorry, but this feels very personal. I don't know anyone else who's seen the hellhound. If I told people about it, they'd likely think I was talking baloney. But I remember after we saw that thing in the road, that it had an outer-worldly quality about it.
It certainly does have an outer-worldly quality. It's a very good way to put it. Seems sort of supernatural, doesn't it? But it's physical in every sense of the word, that's for sure. As to why others don't see it, I don't know, said Michael, shrugging his shoulders nonchalantly. It is what it is. Some enigmatic mysteries cannot be explained. I've seen a Bigfoot too, you know, so I've certainly had my fair share of outer-worldly experiences. But unlike the hellhound, meeting up with the Bigfoot was an experience that literally pulled me out of the brink of my own personal destruction. It was more like an angelic encounter than anything else. If my mother had had such a positive interaction, maybe she wouldn't have drunk herself into an early grave.
You saw a Bigfoot? When did this happen?
Let me see. It was shortly after you walked out on me. I was, as you know, a broken man, falling apart at the seams. Not only had I lost my beloved son, but I had lost the woman I loved more than anything else in the entire world. You were my other half. Without you, it was impossible for me to function. I was physically a complete gibbering mess. I hadn't eaten for days. My clothes were hanging off me, as if they were 3 sizes too big for me. I'd lost so much weight. I probably looked as if I belonged to Auschwitz. My bones were hanging out of my flesh like gnarled roots in the ground. It certainly wasn't pretty. I looked like the walking dead. People told me as much, he said, shuddering. I think people said to me things like, "You look awful, Michael. For God's sake, eat something."
"I'm sorry," I said. "I didn't mean to break your heart. I was so broken up myself, you see. I think I shut everybody else out. And I know after seeing you and listening to everything you've told me, I realise what an idiot I've been. You're right, I was a cold-hearted fish. I'm so sorry." Michael ignored my apology and continued,
I woke up one morning, feeling worse than broken. I was barely coping. I was ravenously hungry, but I'd been refusing myself food. When you're ridden with grief, you don't want to eat. So I was not in a good place physically and emotionally. I was starving hungry, of course, but I just couldn't make myself eat. I'd look at food and just have absolutely no appetite. I decided to take a walk in the woodgrove after someone mentioned to me that some light exercise would likely do me the world of good, and maybe it might inspire me to eat. I felt so weak, like I was going to pass out and faint, but honestly, I didn't care. I had no appetite whatsoever. The food in our refrigerator was off, the milk had gone sour and rancid, the cheese had become mouldy. I hadn't shopped in Fairbanks for anything for ages. There was, of course, canned food in the store cupboard, meat in the freezer, but I ignored all that.
I was surprised to hear my husband confess to this, for when my son died, personally I had gravitated towards sweet, sticky stuff to cushion the blows of my grief. But my ex-husband had completely stopped eating. I guess we react to grief in different ways.
So there I was, walking in the woodgrove. I barely even remember walking there. I was in such a dwell. I guess I was doing this on autopilot, without thinking. I began to stumble awkwardly through the trees. I remember staggering, as if I was an inebriated drunk, reaching out for a trunk to steady myself. My body broke out into a hot sweat. There were beads of perspiration on my forehead. I was breathing heavily. In that moment, I honestly thought I was having a stroke or a heart attack. I guess the weakness of not eating was finally catching up to me. The next thing I knew, Everything began to whirl and spin around me. I became very dizzy and disorientated, and then everything went black. I don't remember anything after that, until I found myself on the forest floor. I was covered with a bear pelt, close to an open, crackling fire, which was lovely and warm. Someone was feeding the flames with firewood. I remember feeling very light-headed when I woke up. It was the middle of the night, early autumn. The temperature had dipped significantly, and for a moment in the ambiguous fog of my weakened state, I lost all sense of my bearings. I was wondering what I was doing in the middle of the woods, how I'd even got there. Then I saw the bullet-shaped silhouette of what I perceived to be an enormous being. It looked humanoid in stature. I could see it clearly under the moonlight. The creature, on sensing that I had woken up, trotted over to me. "And it was a Bigfoot?" I asked. "One and the same," said Michael. I was so disorientated that at first I thought I was hallucinating. Could this 10-foot-tall creature, covered in snow-white hair, even be real? But I was in no doubt what I was seeing. My eyes were not deceiving me. "She had snow-white hair," I gasped. "No, he had snow-white hair," Michael corrected me. "It was a he?" I asked. "No doubt about that at all. He was gargantuan in size, but with such a human, very noble-looking face. He possessed a powerful male energy. Let's just say, next to him, I felt as fragile and small as a paper boat. He claimed to have known me all my life. He'd visited our cabin regularly, had seen how sad I'd recently become. It's not good to be sad, he told me. He then bought some pieces of meat he'd cooked over the flames of the fire. It was deer meat. I was surprised he was using an old barbecue fork for the purpose. When he handed me the meat, it was excellent. I practically wolfed it down. I think the meat was the best food I'd tasted in my entire life. Gordon Ramsay, eat your heart out, he chuckled. "How could the Bigfoot communicate with you like that? Surely he didn't speak English?" I asked. "That's the funny thing," said Michael. "He spoke to me in a strange, enigmatic language, but I understood exactly what he was saying. I guess you could say the meaning of his words appeared to be downloaded in my head. How he was able to communicate like that, God only knows." "That is bizarre," I said. "It sure was," said Michael. "Even when I was eating that delicious meat, I thought I was caught up in a dream. Was I really eating food that had been given to me by a Bigfoot? But as I sat by the crackling flames and enjoyed the warmth, and as we ate together silently, I knew that this was no trick of the light, or of my mind, of course." He continued, "I think the creature could read my thoughts, because he said to me, 'No, this is no dream. I'm real, and I'm here to help you. You need my help. Otherwise you're going to fade away like an autumn leaf.' 'How come I've never seen you before?' I asked him. 'Because you never needed to see me, did you? But now you need to see me, so I can knock some sense into that head of yours, because your son's death is clearly eating you up.' I asked him how he knew about my son. He told me he knew many things about me, that he could see beyond the veil. He asked me why I was so sad, because I would see my son again one day. For him it seemed very strange that I was dwelling on my emotions so much. I asked him how he knew about my son. He told me he knew many things, that he could see beyond the veil. He asked why I was so sad, as I would see my son one day. 'How do you know?' I asked him. 'Because we never die, do we?' he told me. 'Your son runs all over this wood grove. If you're sensitive enough, you should feel his presence, and even hear his laughter.' 'He runs over the wood grove?' I asked him incredulously. 'Yes, he does,' said the Bigfoot. 'I see him quite often. He laughs a lot. He loves visiting the grove of trees.' But he's crossed over, surely, I asked. I was worried, of course, that our son was in limbo. Of course he's crossed over, but that doesn't mean he doesn't want to visit this place. He doesn't like your being sad, that's for sure. The Bigfoot proceeded to tell me that I had passed out from hunger. He'd found me lying on the forest floor after I blacked out. I sat there for a long while, keeping lovely and warm by the fire, talking to this Bigfoot as if it was the most natural thing in the world to do, as if he was an old friend of mine. I soon forgot about how intimidating he was, for he was so benign, so benevolent. Eventually I staggered to my feet, told him that I needed to get back to the cabin, although in truth I didn't want to leave his congenial company. He told me I wasn't strong enough to walk on my own. He insisted on carrying me. I was rather reluctant at first, but I have to admit I felt relief when he picked me up in his overlong arms, as if I weighed nothing more than a feather. He carried me back to the cabin, and watched me as I entered the door, and let myself in. The food I'd eaten with the Bigfoot certainly helped me regain my flagging strength, so the following day I drove into Fairbanks, and did a sizable food shop. My appetite returned. I think the Bigfoot telling me he saw our son running around the woodgrove at times, laughing away to himself, brought me huge comfort, and after that I did feel as if Robin was around watching me all the time, and that certainly made me get back onto my feet.
Wow, that is some story. You promise it's true? It just seems so outlandish. My ex-husband made a face and laughed.
Of course it's true. I wouldn't make something like this up. For a start, I've got a useless imagination. But I will tell you something. I have heard Robin's laughter in the woods, and it is not my imagination. Do you not remember our son had a very distinctive laugh? And that's the laugh I sometimes hear.
You've heard his laugh? I asked, straightening my back. You're not winding me up?
Of course I'm not, said Michael. That would be a mean thing to do. But yes, I have felt Robin's presence. Have you? He asked me, his eyes narrowing to watch my reaction.
No, I can't say I have, I said, my eyes choking up with tears. I've never felt him since he died. Some people say it's because I'm so full of grief that even if my son was standing right next to me, I wouldn't notice him there.
Well, they've got a point, haven't they? Michael reached out to squeeze me by the hand. Maybe when you return to the cabin, you might feel his presence. I know I do. It offers me immeasurable comfort. Maybe Michael visits the cabin, because this is where he was raised. Remember, he loved those woods.
Before long, me and my ex-husband were talking together, as if we'd never been apart, despite a huge gap of 11 years. It felt so natural to be sitting next to him in his car. I found a familiar warmth running through my veins, breaking the cold icicles of my frosty heart. When we arrived at the old wooden cabin, 6.5 hours later, that at one time had been my home, I found the tears of a wistful nostalgia began to spill down my cheeks. It was so good to be back. I felt as if I'd come back home. I tried to wipe the tears away, but I couldn't help myself. I'm sorry, I blubbered. I never knew it would feel like this to be back. Please, don't mind me. Michael took me lovingly into his arms, rocking me backwards and forwards, as if I was a baby. It felt so great to be in his arms again.
It'll be all right, he said.
And the next thing I knew, we were both kissing, and all the hatred I'd felt for so long just dissipated, and I could swear that as I looked up from Michael's tender embrace, that my son had been there watching us and going, yuck. He always said yuck whenever we kissed, and that made me laugh. I feel him! I think I feel him! I told Michael. I feel our son!
Didn't I tell you? Said Michael, grinning.
When the solicitor, Mr. Saxon, came to see me and Michael, 6 days after I'd settled into the cabin, he was greeted to a couple of lovebirds holding hands, who looked as if they'd returned from a blissful honeymoon. "Hello, Mr. Saxon," I said, greeting him so warmly. He was quite taken aback by my congenial greeting, given that I'd been so cold to him on the telephone.
"You must be Miss Battersby," said Mr. Saxon,
greeting me warmly and giving my hand a firm, friendly handshake.
"It's good to see you, Mr. Saxon," said Michael, shaking his hands. "I'm delighted to tell you that Miss Battersby here will not be Miss Battersby for very much longer," he said, grinning from ear to ear. "We're getting remarried. Our divorce was a grievous mistake. We realized that about an hour after Sam flew in from New York. We should never have gone our separate ways." "Ha! Your mother knew this would happen," said Mr. Saxon, waving his finger. "She insisted that I persuaded you, Miss Battersby, to stay at the cabin for a week with Michael before I performed the reading of the will. It was a set-up, you see, so that the two of you would kiss and make up. What was the word she used? Ah, yes, soulmates. She wasn't wrong about that," said Michael, taking my hand lovingly and lifting it up to his lips. "But you know what, Mr. Saxon? They do say absence makes the heart grow fonder. I feel as if I'm 18 all over again." "Well, it sounds very good," said Saxon. "Based on what you're saying, Michael, I think maybe I should send Mrs. Saxon away for a few years," he said teasingly. "We could do with something to jazz up our marriage."
"I wouldn't recommend 11 years, Mr. Saxon. It's far too long a gap. Believe me, I regret my mistakes. I was so cold-hearted when I left."
"Miss Battersby," said Mr. Saxon, "don't be so hard on yourself. We all react to grief differently. Losing your son, that must have been tough. I'm only glad to see that you and Michael are back together. That is exactly what June wanted, more than anything else in the world. I'm sure she's looking down on you now and celebrating in heaven."
1 year later, it had not been difficult to fall in love with my husband again. The truth was I'd never fallen out of love with him. It had been so easy to blame him and his mother June for my son's death, when neither of them were really to blame. It was my anger that drove a wedge in our relationship. When I first laid eyes on Michael for the first time, after so many years, it was like meeting up with a stranger, but as soon as we got talking in the car, the ice melted. In the 7-hour trip to Fairbanks, I realized that leaving him so abruptly all those years ago had been a grievous, pitiful mistake that I really would live to regret. Before that day even ended, we were back in our king-sized bed, where we remained anchored for almost an entire week, making up for lost time. I had sensed the approving presence of our son Robin in our home. One morning before lunch, me and my husband were taking an ATV ride through the woodgrove. I had quit my job at the New York Presbyterian Hospital a long time ago, and frankly had never looked back. How could I have ever abandoned my life in this idyllic part of the world? I was now making up for lost time, and was giggling like a silly schoolgirl as we meandered through the lofty trees, and then all of a sudden some pebbles went flying at our ATV, and my husband braked immediately, and that was when we saw the male Bigfoot, with his eyes pinned directly on us. He waved a hand in front of us, beckoning for us to be quiet and to listen. Me and my husband cocked up our ears, and then we heard the distinctive laughter of our little boy. The Bigfoot nodded at us and said,
"Gila monilolota, sa quinasi, hilasha. I told you he comes here to play in the woods, your son. Ha minasi, hila tikwani. He never left you." And with that we watched the Bigfoot gliding away through the trees. And I remember realizing there and then that as long as my son was with me in spirit, and Michael was diligently at my side, we could rebuild our lives again, with so much to look forward to in the future. So there you are. That's my story. Wow, what an incredible story. I just don't know what to say about that kind of grief when a mother loses a daughter or a son. It is the most devastating thing that can happen to a parent.
And losing a child of 6 years old or 8 years old, it doesn't matter what age they are, even if they're an older child, it really doesn't make any difference. It is devastating for a parent, and very often relationships fail because the grief is so bad that the relationship just falls apart. So isn't it wonderful that these two people, after 11 years of separation, came together? And as for the hellhound, the harbinger of death, what a horrific thing to encounter on a sequestered country road in the middle of the night. But thankfully the Bigfoot really did bring Michael Rodriguez some hope in his life. So there we are. That's our story. Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, my head is booming madly, like a large impertinent drum that is being beaten from inside my skull. The throbbing pain is excruciating, as it appears to meander from one side of my head to another, almost as if a drummer is beating my head on every side, moving his pounding hand from the right hemisphere of my brain to the left, to the back of my neck, to the top of my skull, to behind my eyes. Stop! I want to scream. Please, bloody stop! What the hell, I think. I don't recall a time when a migraine headache of mine was this insufferable, this unbearable. I've had bad headaches, of course, but this one trumps them all in its intensity. My eyes fly wide open for a brief moment as I consider my bearings, climatizing myself to my environment, as I drift from my sleepy state of semi-consciousness to a subdued wakefulness, with eyes still congealed with sleep, feathered by fluttering eyelashes that do not welcome being fully opened. I realize I'm lying in my bed in my apartment that I share with Victor, my boyfriend. That, of course, makes perfect sense to me. I stare up at the ceiling, and I'm surprised to see a large silken spider web is clinging to the far corner of the ceiling. Normally I'd jump out of bed in a heartbeat to search for a feather duster to eliminate the home invader from my bedroom ceiling, placing him gently on a tissue and flinging him out of the window. I do nothing of the kind, but remain stiffly anchored to my bed, as if my headache has rendered me completely helpless to its formidable control. I groan in the agonizing discomfort of my personal torment, willing this headache away. I would personally like to shut my eyes and be transported back to my dreams, where I can forget about this headache for a moment. But even if I close my eyes, the insane drumming beat persists, for it is determined to make my waking moments a living hell. I find myself feeling rather annoyed that the curtains of our bedroom are not fully drawn, as an invasive, rude, glaring bright light appears to be spilling through the room unapologetically, and everyone knows bright light with migraine headaches do not mix terribly well. It's like putting oil and water together in a jar. They're just not friends. Any more of this obtrusive sunlight really will not be welcome, and yet I can't bring myself to climb out of my bed to shut that curtain. Yet it seems hell-bent on blinding me. I lie there for a moment longer, resting one hand on the side of my pounding head in a self-soothing gesture. For a second the pain dulls to a bearable throb that settles behind my right eye. Why does this always happen to me when I drink far too much alcohol? Why do I never learn from my own catastrophic mistakes? The last time I drank too much in a local bar in town, I was so legless. My friends had to virtually carry me back to their apartment. They were less than amused that they had to deal with their blooded friend. They had placed me on a comfortable couch and covered me with a warm blanket. I had woken up many hours later in an unfamiliar environment with a killer headache, accompanied by curiously ringing ears. And all my bemused friends appeared to be standing over me gingerly, almost as if I was a dissected frog in a laboratory experiment that had still overcome having its innards torn to shreds, while they asked me how I was feeling, and should they call a doctor, because I looked like the living dead, with a pallid complexion and puffy red eyes that were so bloodshot. For a moment I'd scared them half to death, because when I was fast asleep, A weird sound appeared to be coming out of my mouth, that one of my friends said sounded ominously like the death rattle. It had freaked them the hell out. "I don't think you should drink," my friend James had told me, trying to be kind, his eyes narrowing in an expression of deep concern. "You don't seem to be able to hold your drink, and nor are you capable of stopping after one glass of alcohol. You just go on and on." "What do you mean?" I asked incredulously, my voice becoming very defensive. James had become a little bashful. He avoided my piercing gaze, but kept his eyes focused on the ground. He stuttered awkwardly as he spoke. "It's just, you know, once you've had one glass of alcohol, you become—" "Become what?" I snapped. "Go on, say it, James. I know you're dying to. Why are you all gawking at me like that? You're looking at me as if I'm an animal in the zoo that's got 5 legs or something." "Don't be like that," my friend Amelia interjected. "We're just worried about you. Your drinking is getting out of hand. You should see yourself. You go completely crazy when you drink too much." James paused, stirring up the tense atmosphere between us. He tried to choose his tactful, well-meaning words carefully, while one of my friends was nudging him, telling him to quit while he was ahead, because they could lightly see that I was not in a receptive mood to be receiving a telling off. But James was not easily put off. He'd always been frank and upfront with me. "Well, you know, you become like a spirited, unbridled wild horse once you start drinking. I don't say that lightly. You become almost frenzied in your behaviour. You seize all the alcohol you can get your hands on. I've even seen you snatch people's drinks out of their hands before, causing quite a stir. You knock alcohol back like Kool-Aid until you can barely stand up on your own 2 feet. You lose all your inhibitions. Last night when we brought you back to the apartment, you were practically unconscious. We were very concerned about you. And when you started breathing, it resembled the death rattle. We thought you might need an ambulance." "He's not joking," said my friend Claudette. "You freaked us the hell out, you really did. We have no clue how much you drank last night, but it was way too much. James is absolutely right. If you don't stop overdoing it, you could kill yourself. There is such a thing as drinking too much in one sitting, so much so that your liver can pack up. I've heard about that before." "But I don't do that," I said. "You're lying. I'd never behave like that." James had sighed, pulling out the cell phone from his pocket and reluctantly sifting through his videos. "Take a look at this," he said soberly, handing me the footage to watch that he'd taken of my drunken behaviour the previous night. The footage was not pretty. I felt myself in the cold, callous light of day, having to face the naked truth of my humiliation. There I was with my red dress, crawling up my legs so that it barely concealed my modesty. It was mortifying to watch myself, with no inhibitions whatsoever. My legs were unflatteringly splayed out, in peculiar angles, like a floppy rag doll. My eyes seemed almost glazed over, and I had a very stupid smirk on my face. I appeared to be laughing, and had gone up to a stranger's table and grabbed their bottle of wine from them. "Excuse me, that's our wine," came a woman's indignant voice. "I think you'll find it's mine now," I slurred cheekily, knocking back a few swigs in front of the horrified strangers, giving them a manic grin. "Your wine is mine," I said proudly. "I think you've had more than enough, young lady," said the woman kindly. "Now that's where you're wrong," I said, pointing my fingers at her. "That's where you're wrong." I began staggering around the bar like a loose cannon, damaging everything in my wake, causing devastation with everything I touched, as chairs fell back onto the floor and tables heaved and groaned as I pushed past them. Even the manager was saying, "This woman is out of control. Someone needs to deal with her." James had rushed forward apologetically, assuring this bar manager that he'd sort me out. I was slapping him furiously, telling him,
Leave me alone! Leave me alone! Leave me alone! I want another drink! I want another drink! Where's another drink? Where's another drink? I need another drink!"
My legs seemed to be crumbling beneath me, and then I collapsed into an almost comatose heap. I had made an embarrassing spectacle of myself. I did not recognize the trashy woman in the footage as myself, but it was. There was no running away from the truth when it was blazingly staring me in the face. "I can't look at this any more," I said to James, thrusting his cell phone back in his hands. "I can't believe I behaved like that. Why didn't you bloody stop me from making a complete idiot of myself? Everybody was watching me in that footage. I can't imagine what they were thinking."
"You're impossible to stop when you get drunk, Pammy," said James ruefully. "But I think you now know why you need to not drink ever again. Some people just can't drink alcohol. You don't handle it very well, and you don't seem to be able to exercise any moderation or self-control."
"But I don't understand. I'm only 30, for God's sake. I should be able to handle my alcohol, shouldn't I? I'm not a decrepit old lady. Why is your constitution so good? Look at you. You can knock back beers by the dozen, and you don't even get drunk. And then look at me. It's so not fair."
"I can handle my alcohol well, Pammy. But if it makes you feel better, you're not alone. There are others like you that can't handle alcohol. You just don't metabolize it well. I'm significantly bigger than you are, and that helps a lot."
"I am never going to drink again," I had said resolutely. "Never. Look at me. I look like a hooker the way I'm behaving in the bar. You can almost see my knickers in that shot. My dress is just rolling up my legs so high. I look like a loose woman that has the morals of an alley cat. I feel completely ashamed. Did you see how I was virtually groping that poor woman's husband? She's trying to get me off him. With the back of the menu, she's slamming it in my back. And I'm taking no notice of her whatsoever. The poor man looks completely bemused. I'm removing his tie and stroking his chest as if he's a cat. What the hell am I doing? God knows what I'm capable of doing when I'm off my trolley like this."
"My thoughts precisely," said James. "It's not pretty, is it? You are sozzled. You have absolutely no idea what you're doing, and you're making a complete spectacle of yourself. Let's not kid. In your sobriety, you're one of the most dignified ladies I know. So watching you half-cut like this is very troubling. The girl in this video footage is not you, is it?"
"You're damned right that's not me. I'm so embarrassed. I'm never going to be seen dead going into that bar again. Imagine what everybody will think of me when they see me again."
"Don't be like that. I'm sure the bar staff have seen worse before. And the locals in the bar have seen drunken behaviour. It's not as if it's completely idiosyncratic to them."
"I doubt they've seen anyone as wild as I am. I don't think anyone could humiliate themselves more than I did in that footage. How can I ever show my face again?" As a result of the alarming footage of my outrageously out-of-control drunken behaviour in that bar, I had stopped drinking forthwith, and faithfully stuck to my sobriety rigidly, until last night, that is. I tried to remember what had been different about last night, but the events of the previous evening seemed locked behind a foggy, cloudy obscurity that was so ambiguously vague that I struggled to remember a thing. It was like trying to look through a blackened-out shop window and trying to figure out what was going on inside. At least I was safely cocooned in my bed at home, and not lying suspended across someone's couch, trying to determine where the hell I was. All of a sudden the memories flooded back in my mind, as they came sauntering back into my awareness. No wonder I'd been drinking last night. It's not every night you get engaged. For once in my life I was entitled to thoroughly enjoy myself and let my hair down, especially on such a celebratory, festive occasion such as this. My eyes rolled towards the sleeping lump on my side, and I remind myself that this big, sizable lump, cocooned between the folds of silken sheets of our sumptuously cosy bed, is my fiancé Victor. I'm a lucky girl. It's not as if the engagement was a huge surprise, though. Victor and I have been dating each other for the last 8 months. I moved into his apartment block in Spokane, Washington, only a month ago, and we've been pretty much inseparable ever since. Victor has been hinting for as long as I can remember that I'm the one he wants to spend the rest of his life with, and I felt much the same. As I lie back in my bed, I chuckle happily to myself as I think of the story that unfolded last night, and boy, it was some story. When I'd returned home from work, I had decided we would have a cheese omelette for supper, given that there really wasn't much in the refrigerator beyond cheese and eggs, so the choices were rather limited. My boyfriend was following me every move in the kitchen, which I thought was profoundly odd. He was like a dog getting under my feet the whole time, which was a tad annoying, but I said nothing. I decided he must really be hungry to follow my every move. He was clearly impatient to fill his stomach.
"It sounds marvellous," he was saying. "I was hoping you were going to make me a cheese omelette. You make the best cheese omelette this side of Washington."
"Well, it's not like we've got much choice," I said, studying the empty, pitiful shelves of the refrigerator. There was a bowl of pickles, some sad-looking salad leaves tucked in cellophane that looked like they'd passed their very best, and some mouldy cheese. So unless we were to order takeout, we were pretty much out of options. "I know I should have gone to the shops," I apologized, "but I couldn't get my damn mother off the phone. She's going on and on about what colour she should paint her living room wall."
"Sounds interesting," said Victor. "I had no idea your mother was so interested in interior design."
"She's not," I said briskly. "That's the strange thing." In truth, my mother was not inclined to be indecisive about anything, and so in the end I'd gone to her house to look through the colour options for her, and I think she almost settled for a buttercup yellow for her living room wall, but that was still debatable. "I don't think you should go shopping, dear," my mother had said. "You don't want to go to the supermarket now, not this late, and look at you, you look dreadfully tired." Little did I know my mother had been in on the masterful plan to ensure there was only enough food in the apartment to guarantee I had to make a cheese omelette for supper. It had all been a cunning set-up to accommodate Victor's plans.
"I was hoping you would say that you would make an omelette tonight. I feel like one of your cheese omelettes,"
Victor said, sounding satisfied. My word, he was going on and on about my cheese omelettes. But it was true, even if I say so myself. I did make a mean omelette. So I pulled the frying pan from the shelf, and there in the pan, on a piece of cardboard, were the words, "Will you marry me?" My heart began to do somersaults in my chest. I turned around to find Victor kneeling on the ground, with an open velvet blue box in his hand, containing the most beautiful diamond engagement ring. For a moment I was rather bemused and taken aback, staring at Victor in disbelief. My mouth must have dropped to the floor, as everything felt so surreal. The diamond was small, but absolutely perfect.
"For God's sake, Pammy, don't keep a man in suspense," he teased. "Will you marry me or not? Yes or no? What's the answer?"
"Yes, yes, of course I'll marry you," I cried out in delight. "Yes, yes. I'm surprised you needed to ask." Victor's grin was so broad, I was absolutely amazed that it managed to fit on his face.
"Right now, Pammy Sanderson, you, my love, have made me the happiest man in the entire world. This calls for a celebration, and I've got the very thing, the finest French champagne," he had spouted enthusiastically. He removed an irresistible bottle of champagne from an ice bucket that I hadn't even observed before. "But you know I can't drink, Victor," I said. "You know what I get like. I told you all about that." Victor had laughed. "You don't drink because you get legless. But it would be a criminal offence not to drink tonight, on the eve of our celebration. I mean, we're getting married, so let your hair down, for goodness sake. And if we both get bladdered, who cares about it?" he said nonchalantly. "It's not like we're going anywhere. We're not leaving the apartment. And I'm hardly going to complain if you grope me, am I?" he said, cocking his eyebrows in amusement. "Indeed, be my guest. I'm all yours," he said,
with a wicked twinkle in his eyes. "Well, when you put it like that," I said coquettishly, "how can I refuse?" Victor removed some bags of groceries he'd hidden in our store cupboard. My eyes grew wide in amazement.
"Well, it turns out I did a bit of a speciality shop, especially for us," said Victor proudly. "These are for us to enjoy. I'm cooking us a celebratory dinner tonight, so there is no cheese omelette on the menu. Your mother's been such an amazing sport. She stopped you from doing a shop tonight. All that stuff about not knowing what colour to paint her living room was just a cunning ruse."
"Ah, you don't say," I said, raising a brow. "My mother is the end. I should have smelt a rat when she kept saying she wanted to paint the living room orange. I thought she'd lost leave of her senses, when all the time she was just winding me up. I've never known her to be so indecisive before, but she seemed pretty determined to paint the living room orange, I can tell you that."
"Well, I'm glad she had you fooled. That was the whole idea. But it was a little risque of her suggesting she should paint her living room orange, when she's very conservative," said Victor, laughing. "But then again, your mother does have a remarkably good sense of humour."
"Now, my sweetheart," said Victor, taking my hand in his, "I've got something to show you. Come with me." He led me directly to our bathroom. "This is especially for you. I know how much you love to take a long hot soak in a bath." "You did all this for me?" I gasped, throwing my arms around Victor, tears of appreciation gathering in the back of my eyes. "Am I by any chance Cleopatra, or a woman of equally high standing?" I asked him.
"You are indeed," said Victor, "and so much more besides. You are my princess. Do you like it?"
I breathed in the beautiful bouquet of roses. "Like it? I absolutely love it! This is incredible! I can't believe you've done all this for me. I don't know what to say." It would seem our very ordinary bathroom, that was begging for a new bathroom suite and a makeover, with sinks that were slightly cracked, and faucets that had definitely seen better days, looked almost perfect in the soft, mellow, dewy light of the white, flickering candles, of which there appeared to be hundreds splayed generously all over the bathroom cabinets. Then there was the low-slung bath, filled to overflowing with fragrant rose petals among the steam. On the mirror, using my lipstick, Victor had drawn a heart which said, "Victor and Pammy forever." My heart quivered with delight, as Victor was not by nature a very romantic man. So when I saw the thought that he'd put behind this proposal, I was really chuffed. I was a lucky girl to be marrying a man like him, that was for sure.
"You relax. I want you to have a long hot bath," said Victor,
kissing me tenderly on the cheeks and putting on some soft background music for me to enjoy.
"I will be in the kitchen preparing us a celebratory dinner. You take as long as you like in the bath."
"It sounds so wonderful," I said. It didn't take me long to disrobe. Soon I was slipping gratefully into the hot bath that would soon soothe the aches away of a long drawn-out day spent at the office. I was privately laughing at the memory of my mother saying, "But I love this orange colour, Pammy. It would look fabulous in our living room. It's a very popular colour in Morocco for living spaces, you know. I can show you a magazine I've got." "Mum, you can't possibly paint your living room orange." "Why ever not, my dear?" "Because it won't work, that's why. Your furnishings are very conservative. If you're admiring the Moroccan colour schemes, that's fine and all well and good. But they work because the furnishings all blend beautifully together. Your furnishings won't look good like that, with an orange background. It would certainly look out of place in here." "On the contrary, my dear, I disagree with you," my mother had said. "I'm so damn tired of these wishy-washy monochromatic colour schemes. Everyone in our neck of the woods sticks to safe, mediocre colours in their homes, and it's so boring. Look what this designer has to say. Now, his name is Pierre White." My mother pulled out a very sensible pair of silver-framed glasses, which she placed on the edge of her nose, on her silvery blue eyes. She read the commentary. "We need to take more risks here in North America, and take a leaf out of the designer palettes of the Moroccans.
who use bright colours to bring glamour to their living spaces. More recently, after my visit to Morocco, I was greatly inspired by what I observed. I realized unequivocally that colour can transform our homes dramatically, in miraculous ways, and we need to stop being afraid of being reluctant to use it in our homes. Since I have transformed my own home with such rich, vibrant colours, I feel as if I'm living in an exotic place, and the ambience of my home has changed exponentially. So if you need a facelift in your life, look no further than transforming the walls of your home, and try experimenting with interesting colour combinations. You might be pleasantly surprised by the result. Isn't it worth taking a risk in your life? I think your mother's right, my father had said, bounding into the room with a huge grin on his face. I'm partial to painting the living room orange. I think Pierre White is right about what he says in that article. I had looked at my parents with an appalled expression on my face. You've got to be kidding me, Dad. Not you, too. Where did these outlandish, idiosyncratic ideas come from in the first place? Well, from the article for a start, said my mother. And your father and I are so tired of dull colours. We want more vibrancy in our lives, don't we? And you have to admit, Pierre White does have a very good point. He's right on the money about people being too damn afraid to use colour in their living spaces. Yes, but bright orange, Mum. That's so... So what? Asked my father, raising a brow. So over the top. I mean, think about it. This room is white. It's quite a leap from white to orange, don't you think? It's not white, Pamela. It's honey beige, my mother insisted, seemingly insulted that I would dare suggest her walls were white. But to be fair, it was hard to tell the difference. All shades of white were pretty much the same to me, rather standard. Well, whatever. I mean, if you want your walls to be brighter, that's fine. But settle for something more subtle. How about this? I said, lifting up a buttercup yellow swatch. This one is not too bad, and it would go rather well with your white furnishings, don't you think? You could bring in some blues, and it would look very chic. You know, yellow, blue and white can look stunning together. I'll think about it, love, my mother had said. I do like yellow, but I rather had my heart set on the orange. I'm not sure how long I lay in the bath smiling to myself, as I reflected over how upset I'd become over my parents wanting to paint their living room orange. They'd clearly been winding me up, and this revelation brought me immeasurable relief. For a moment I thought my mother had completely lost leave of her senses. Once I climbed out of the bath and towel-dried my steaming body, I felt incredibly relaxed and invigorated, although my body was throbbing from the heat of the bath, and my heart pounding in my chest. Victor never shared a bath with me, for this very reason. He was not brave enough to get into the hot water that I enjoyed basking in. I was one of those people with asbestos hands, and could touch things that would burn others. I wondered what I should wear for my fiancé's surprise dinner downstairs. I felt I should make some effort to look elegant, if Victor had gone to so much trouble on my account. So I put my long dark hair up away from my face, and dappled my lips in a bright red lipstick, taking a long hard look at myself in the misty mirror. You look lovely, Victor said to me appreciatively, when I entered the dining room, wearing a black dress with shoestring straps and high-heeled strappy sandals. I thought you were just going to wear your onesie with a pair of fluffy slippers. I didn't expect you to dress up after a hard day at the office. I wanted you to relax. That was the whole idea. But I have to dress up, don't you see, if I'm going to be drinking French champagne, I had said with a mischievous twinkle. I don't want to insult the bottle of champagne, do I, by being rudely underdressed in its company? Well, you're certainly not going to do that. You look absolutely gorgeous. The dining room table also looked wonderful. Victor had pulled out all the stops and had arranged pink and white peonies in a vase. He had lit 7 candles in a silver candelabra, so that the mellow light sent subtle shadows over the dining room, washing the table in a golden glaze. This is incredible, Victor. It's so beautiful, I said, eyeing the table in awe. You've excelled yourself here.
You've actually become such a romantic. I never knew you would do something like this for me."
"Well, only the best for you, my love," said Victor modestly. "Come and sit over here, will you?" he said, escorting me to a dining-room chair by my arm, which he pulled out for me so chivalrously. Soft music was playing in the background. It sounded like Beethoven. It was so tranquilizing, and set a very romantic mood around the table. "Don't you dare move an inch. Stay exactly where you are," said Victor, holding up a hand. "Food is on its way. It's about to be served."
Moments later, Victor entered the dining room with 2 large steaming white plates of spaghetti Alfredo. They were served with salad and garlic bread, and this was followed by New York strawberry cheesecake. I groaned in ecstatic pleasure as the pasta melted in my mouth. It had been wonderful, the food absolutely delicious. I couldn't fault it. I had no idea that Victor could cook like this. If he carried on this way, my cheese omelettes might be a memory of the past. Victor had taken lessons with a chef to get the meal exactly right for me, and it had been better than perfect. I marvelled that he had gone to this trouble on my behalf. Victor raised his champagne glass and toasted the 2 of us.
"To the most beautiful woman in the entire world, who has agreed to become my wife," he said.
"To the most wonderful man in the world," I replied, as my glass chinked with Victor's. Thank you for doing all this for me. I don't know what to say. I'm over the moon. This is so beautiful. I shan't forget this as long as I live. I'll be telling our grandchildren about this."
"I hope you will. I shan't forget it either."
I had drunk so much because I quite literally could not remember the rest of that evening, but that did not matter. I might have a hangover from hell this morning, but maybe for once this god-awful migraine headache had been worth its punishing consequences, for the champagne had been absolutely delicious, and the gastronomic food I'd enjoyed last night had been memorable to say the least. We had spent the evening discussing what we were going to do for our wedding, and where to go for our honeymoon. I fancied going to Italy and kissing under the bridge of Versailles, on a gondola. Victor fancied going to Paris.
"Isn't that where all romantic couples go when they're on their honeymoon?"
he kept saying. We argued between what was more romantic, Paris or Italy, and I'm not sure whether we reached a decision or agreed to disagree on the subject. I certainly regretted the fact that most of the evening had all but been an ambiguous foggy blur, and if I hadn't drunk so much alcohol, I wouldn't be suffering from such a thunderous headache as a consequence. Still, I reminded myself, as I lay back in my bed, it's not every day you get engaged. So even though I was inwardly dying because of this excruciating, intolerable headache, some things were worth dying for. Well, almost. I glanced down at my body to discover I was completely naked, and my black dress and sandals were splayed across the floor in a messy, haphazard heap. I was probably so zonked I had failed to put on my onesie. I loathed nothing more than going to bed in my birthday suit. It made me feel rather exposed and vulnerable. But modesty after a few drinks didn't even know my name. Indeed, when I got drunk, I let it all hang out, without any shame, like a baby trotting innocently around a lawn, playing with a sprinkler, without wearing a thing. I blushed with embarrassment as I realized that I wasn't wearing a thing under the folds of my sheet, even though it was only Victor in the bed next to me. Ostensibly, when I was naked, I always felt there were hundreds of unseen eyes watching me, which would make me feel very self-conscious. My best friend Shelley had asked me once, "Do you think when people die they can watch us from heaven, when we're on the toilet or something, or naked in the shower cubicle?" The thought had mortified me, as my brother's friend had died in a car wreck, and he had always fancied me. I often wondered if he was clandestinely peeking at me lecherously from beyond the veil, having a good old perverted gawk. The thought creeped me out, as I lay there thinking of an assortment of things in my mind. My thoughts flapped around, rather like a plastic bag that got ensnared on a branch, being blown around by the wind. I smiled as I thought about my 6-foot-tall, long-legged, handsome fiancé, with his brown, spiky hair, his cute dimples on the sides of his cheeks, the soft, fashionable, slightly prickly stubble on his chin, and his sparkling hazel-brown eyes. We were getting married, I thought happily to myself. The thought hugged me warmly. Too bad about my thunderous headache that refused to relinquish its firm hold over me, as it was spitefully spoiling my revelry. I glanced around my bedroom and couldn't help thinking it looked rather different, much smarter than I remembered it to be. Maybe I was seeing the world through rose-coloured spectacles now that I was engaged, and the imperfections of things seemed to escape my attention. Seeing things through romantic, dewy eyes, that was what this was. I sit up in bed, kicking off the blankets and pulling a sheet around my body. I've never been completely comfortable with my nakedness. I always feel the need to cover myself up. Perhaps it goes back to the Garden of Eden, of Eve becoming self-conscious of her nakedness. I can hear the soft breathing of my fiancé, who's probably sleeping off his inebriation. It would be cruel to wake him up from his slumber. The thunderous aches at the back of my head remind me that I never ever want to drink again. I certainly won't be indulging in French champagne again, not even on my wedding day, because I don't want to forget that day. I don't like the feeling of parts of my memory being blotted out by an amnesia that I will never recover, for that's what drink tends to do to me. Never again, I mumble under my breath, never again, even if it's the best French champagne in the world, and even if it's being drunk in Paris, it's not worth it, I decide. I don't want to ever feel this rotten. With a sheet wrapped around my naked body, like a Greek tunic, to keep me warm and to spare my modesty, I managed to stumble rather awkwardly into the bathroom, flicking the bathroom light on. I'm surprised to see how clean the bathroom is. There are no remaining traces of red rose petals in the bath, and all the candles from the previous night, that had been romantically burning brightly around the bath, have been removed, along with the lipstick heart on the mirror, which said Pammy and Victor forever. I'm kind of disappointed that my fiancé removed that. I would have kept it on the mirror indefinitely, if I had my way. Instead, the mirror is gleaming, as if it's just been polished. As I study the bathroom through narrowing eyes, something is not right. Not only did Victor clean up the bathroom fastidiously last night, probably after I'd enjoyed wallowing in the bath, but as I look at the sink in the bathroom suite, I'm unable to comprehend what I'm actually seeing. Is it possible that Victor went on a home repair spree last night, refitting our bathroom fastidiously with new fixtures and fittings? Surely I'd have remembered something like that. Was this another one of his incredulous, rather remarkable surprises? An engagement present, perhaps? We had certainly talked about changing the bathroom ensuite, but I don't think Victor is any good at do-it-yourself. And how could he have possibly retiled the whole bathroom like this, all on his own last night, while I was lying passed out on our couch? What the hell was going on here? Nothing makes sense. The sink is whiter than white, and is no longer cracked. The faucets shine like brand new pins, and the bath stands on two very sophisticated black legs, and is no longer dipped low into the ground. And as for our run-of-the-mill, mediocre prison-style toilet, it has been literally replaced with a sophisticated, sleek, rather swanky Japanese model. And it has an inbuilt flush mechanism that means you don't even have to use toilet paper. I shake my head incredulously as I try to recall what we'd done last night. Had Victor made any mention of a renovation project? I try to remember everything, but my memory of the previous night becomes blurred and very vague. I glance through the crack in the bathroom door to study the bedroom closely, noticing that Victor is wrapped up in a blanket over his comforter. He never normally sleeps like that, as more often than not Victor fights and wrestles with his bedding during the night, waking up to find himself on top of all the sheets, not swaddled by them as he is now. But as I scrutinize all the bed covers, I realize that they too look different. When we moved in together, me and Victor went to the Home Depot to select bed covers for our bedroom, so that I could confiscate the bachelor pad-like influences of the room and bring in a feminine touch. I had chosen a soft minty green comforter and matching bed linen, but Victor is covered in a white one. And where are the colourful selection of cushions that usually end up on the floor, that Victor thinks are surplus to requirements, and I think are very pretty? Did Victor also change our bed linen last night, without even consulting me? Did he decide to do some home improvements, while I lay passed out on the couch from an alcoholic intoxication. Another surprise for me, perhaps. No, it couldn't be. I find myself suddenly going quite dizzy and disorientated. I hold on to the door frame of the bathroom to steady myself as I stare at the lump under the duvet. It feels as if the whole room is spinning around me. I guess my blood sugar has dipped significantly. I often feel rather faint after I've drunk too much, and with a thumping headache, I feel like death warmed up. Sweat begins to break out unapologetically on my brow. I become hot, shaky, and weak. I try to steady my strengthless body and sink to the bathroom floor in a debilitated, feeble heap. The bathroom floor, I realize, is different too. Bloody hell! What is going on here? It's made up of white marble tiles. No wonder my feet feel as cold as ice. I sit prostrate on the floor, feeling incredibly frail, as if all the life has been drained away from my feeble body. I feel like I've gained 100 years in age. My body has become almost like an old lady. I breathe heavily, as if I'd been running a marathon, my heart pounding violently in my chest, and a little voice comes out of my mouth. "Victor! Victor! Victor!" The large lump in the bed rolls over. The body sits up in an upright position and looks directly at me. But it's not Victor that's looking at me. It's Ian Fleming. What the hell is he doing in my bed? Where is Victor, my fiancé? Ian looks concerned and dashes over to me, lifting me up to my feet, running his hands against my forehead. "You're burning up." I feel faint. What's going on? What am I doing here? Ian gives me a grin. "Don't say you've forgotten. Last night was wonderful. You were wild. What a night we had," he said. "What a night." "What do you mean?" I ask. "What do you mean? What am I doing here in your apartment? I don't understand. How did I even get here?" "Don't you remember?" said Ian, unable to hide the disappointment on his handsome face. His brown eyes almost looked regretful. "I returned home to the apartment block last night. There you were, rummaging around in your car. You said you were looking for a bottle of French champagne your mother had given you, that you couldn't wait to drink. You were already half cut, I hasten to say. I saw you there, asked if you needed a hand. Then you insisted on coming back to my apartment with me. I've always fancied you, Pamela, but you've never been remotely interested in me until last night. It was an amazing evening. I've always liked you, Pammy. I hope this can be a start of a good thing between us. There's definitely a spark here. I've been looking for a girl like you to come into my life. Do you remember that song? It certainly applies to us." "You mean we were intimate together?" "Oh, you were wild in bed last night. I've never met anyone quite like you, Pammy. You're hot stuff, you know." Why would you take advantage of me if you could see I was drunk? I mean, what's wrong with you?" "Excuse me," said Ian, looking quite affronted. "You were the one tearing my clothes off, not the other way round. Although I wished you wouldn't keep calling me Victor." My face dropped, as I remember my mother had handed me a bottle of French champagne when I was leaving her house the previous night. It was probably because she knew that Victor was about to propose to me. "What's this for, Mum?" I'd asked her. "You know I don't drink alcohol." "Sweetheart, I was given this bottle of champagne. Why don't you take it with you? Me and your father, we're wine drinkers. One day you might have occasion to celebrate with it." I had taken the bottle of French champagne very begrudgingly from my mother and put it carefully in the trunk of my car. I could well have done without the temptation of alcohol of any kind in my home, as my intention was to embrace sobriety, but my mother was insistent I took the bottle. She knew that me and Victor would be celebrating our engagement that evening. After drinking with Victor, I had remembered the champagne in the car. We lived in an apartment block. and Victor was lying on the sofa chuckling away, waving his empty glass of champagne in his hand.
"We need more alcohol," I had said, slurring my words. "We need more alcohol, and I've got some in the back of the trunk of my car, downstairs. I'll go and get it. My mother got me some champagne yesterday." "Don't be long, my sweet temptress," Victor had giggled. "Don't be long." "Champagne is coming up," I'd said. "I'll be back. I won't be long. Just wait where you are."
I had stumbled out of my apartment, gone down the escalator to the underground parking bay, and staggered around my car, not being able to tell the front end from the back, trying to locate the whereabouts of the French champagne. I imagine Ian saw me in my struggle and came to my rescue. I probably threw myself at him, but I have no memory of my absurd behaviour. But I knew how I became when I was drunk, and it wasn't pretty. This wasn't the first time I'd thrown myself at a perfect stranger, and if I carried on drinking like this, it would certainly not be my last. Ian looked at me pensively.
"Are you sure you're all right, Pammy? You've gone quite white."
"No, I'm not all right, Ian. None of this was supposed to happen. I have no memory of last night. I'm sorry, but I have no interest in you, and I don't know how I ended up in bed with you. This was a grievous mistake on my part."
"But I don't understand," said Ian. "You were so very keen last night. I thought you really liked me."
"Then you're very much mistaken, because I don't like you, Ian. I don't fancy you, and I never will. I was drunk last night. Please will you turn around and don't look. I need to get dressed."
"I've already seen it all, Pam. There's no need to be so bashful. You certainly weren't last night. You were very keen on me then."
"Turn around, Ian," I growled. "Don't you dare look. I need to get dressed."
All right. Keep your hair on,"
said Ian, turning his back to me, as I scrambled hurriedly towards my clothes that were lying haphazardly in puddles across the floor. What happened next was a complete blur, but I knew I needed to get the hell out of Ian's apartment. Soon I found myself staggering back to Victor's apartment, feeling still shaky on my legs. I was holding my car and front door keys in my hands, and they were jangling. Ian shouted after me,
"Come on, Pammy. Let's talk about this. Be reasonable. I really like you a lot. Last night wouldn't have happened if you didn't feel the same way about me too."
"You're wrong about that," I growled contemptuously. "You took advantage of me, Ian. I was drunk. I didn't know what I was doing," I said, pointing my car keys at him accusingly. "Now leave me the hell alone. I don't want to ever see you again. I wouldn't fancy you if you were the last man on earth." My head was thundering. I was feeling faint and dizzy. I thundered down the corridor in my bare feet, holding my high-heeled strappy sandals in my hand. I somehow, through my blinded confusion, managed to make my way back to the apartment. How I did this, I still don't know. I clandestinely pushed open the door of our apartment that I had failed to lock. I was grateful to see Victor was passed out on the sofa. He was lying there fast asleep, blissfully unaware of what was going on. He was letting out a very gentle snore. I stood over him for a while, just watching him. He must have sensed my intrusive presence, as slowly he opened one lazy eye after another, and then gave me a big grin.
"Come here, my beautiful, gorgeous wife-to-be,"
he said, drawing me affectionately into his arms. But I remained rigidly stiff and unyielding.
"Look at us. We're both wearing last night's clothes. I must have passed out when you went to the car to get the champagne. Did you get it, by the way? I can't even remember."
"It wasn't there," I lied. "I looked for it in my trunk. I must have left it at my mother's house. Silly me."
"Well, it's a good thing anyway. We already drank far too much. Well, I did come back from the car. I noticed you were fast asleep on the couch, so I decided not to wake you. I passed out myself, I said, pointing to a spot on the carpet. Over there, I think it was. My God, what's wrong with us? And what's wrong with me? Said Victor, looking bemused. I usually hold my drink better than I did last night. Well, remember, we did drink quite a few tequilas last night, on top of the French champagne. We knocked back quite a few. Remember, you brought a bottle of tequila with you, I reminded him. Oh, yes, that's right. I do remember. But it was your bright idea to have more than one. I think we downed a whole lot, did we not? I think we did. You're right about that. Victor groaned. As a result, I've got a thundering headache. I'm going to bed. I'm completely knackered. My body is as stiff as anything sleeping on that couch. I've got the hangover from hell. Are you coming with me, Pammy? He said, reaching out to take my hand. I don't want to be lonely in bed. Thank God it's the weekend. I couldn't possibly go to work feeling as deadbeat as I do now. I can't remember the last time I felt this bad. You think you've got a problem with alcohol, Pammy? I think I'm a close runner-up, let me tell you.
We both retired to bed at about 8:30 in the morning, swigging back Tylenol tablets to alleviate our throbbing headaches. Along with large glasses of Coca-Cola, for our bodies were definitely craving sugar. Indeed, our sugar levels had significantly plummeted, and I had learnt a long time ago that low blood sugar contributes to giving you the headache from hell. I woke up in my bed hours later, feeling groggy, disorientated, and very confused. I was wondering where I was, and what time it was. I was thankful that my headache had been vanquished, and I was feeling a lot more like my old self. Soft prisms of silvery moonlight bounded confidently through the crack in the curtains. I must have been asleep for about 16 hours, possibly longer. I couldn't be sure. I glanced at the clock on the side table. It said 10 p.m. I gasped. Was it really that late? I couldn't believe I'd been out for the count for so very long. All the alcohol had taken a toll on my body, and I was still feeling a little wilted. I glanced over towards Victor's side of the bed, surprised to see it was empty, cold to the touch. Where on earth was he? I could feel some paper crumpling around me, and I glanced down to find a note from Victor. Did not want to wake up my beautiful fiancé. You were dead to the world. Would you believe it? Lucas is in a right state. His girlfriend broke up with him last night while we were getting engaged. I'm going to spend the night at his apartment. He needs to talk to someone. He's very sorrowful. I think I should spend some quality time with him to offer him some comfort, take him out for a few beers or so to drown his sorrows. Don't worry, I shan't get drunk again. I'm still suffering from a bloody hangover from hell. I won't tell him we got engaged yet. That would be far too upsetting for him, to know that while we got it together, his relationship was falling apart. That really would be rubbing salt into the wound, and I couldn't do that to him. See you tomorrow. Love you, Pammy. I read the note 3 more times. It really was sad news. I knew that Lucas, Victor's brother, must be in a genuine sorry state. He had been dating his beloved girlfriend, Sandy Ballersman, since junior high school, and adored the bones of her. He made no secret of the fact that she was the woman he wanted to marry. So her breaking up with him so fortuitously was not on the cards. Lucas must be feeling like a butterfly with its wings torn off, that could no longer fly. There was no doubt in my mind the man must be devastated. As I sat up in my bed, my eyes soon adjusted to the dark shadows that danced around the bedroom, and the lights from people's headlights as they drove down our street, that lit up my bedroom in prisms of bright light, so that the silhouettes of my bed and dresser became conspicuously clear. In a trice my thoughts began to settle. I suddenly became haunted by the memories of the last 24 hours that galloped into my head, so that the unpleasant recall left me squirming in self-disgust. For a moment I desperately tried to believe It had all been an illusory dream. In the spurious dream, Victor had proposed to me. We had had a wonderful evening together, and then on my urgent, insatiable quest to get even more alcohol from the trunk of my car, some French champagne that my mother had given me, I had ended up having a fortuitous encounter with Ian Fleming himself, and subsequently had woken up in his bed in the wrong apartment. Ian Fleming had claimed we'd been intimate together. In one night I had agreed to marry Victor, then I'd ended up in another man's bed, with absolutely no memory of the event. I shivered in revulsion and in an abhorrent self-loathing. Since we had moved into the apartment, me and Victor would occasionally bump into Ian Fleming, who had the audacity once to ask me out for a drink. I had told him in no uncertain terms that my boyfriend Victor would not like it, and that had been that. I thought he'd got the message. Well, so I thought. But last night my unscrupulous behaviour had gone completely awry, and the worst part of it all is that I had amnesia about the event. What the hell was I going to do about my betrayal to my fiancé? I jerked myself out of bed, my heart thundering in my chest. I couldn't tell Victor what had happened last night, could I? He'd be so disappointed in me. I had cheated on him last night, with my eyes wide shut, you could say. The bitter, cold and cruel truth was I had woken up completely naked in Ian Fleming's bed, which had left me to bashfully conclude that I might have got up to all kinds of shenanigans last night, and the truth is, I'd never know. I grabbed my cell phone and dialed James's number. "Please don't have switched your cell phone off, James," I inwardly begged. "You need to answer, and you need to answer now."
"Hello there. What's up?" came James's cheerful voice. "I was watching Netflix on my bed. I dozed off. Do you realize what time it is? It's not like you to phone me this late. Is everything all right?"
"No, everything's not all right," I said obsequiously. "Something bad has happened. I'm in a right pickle, James. I can't talk about it on the cell phone. I need to see you now. Victor is away for the evening. He's only back tomorrow morning. I need to talk to you in private. I thought we could go for a drive in the countryside and talk. It's important, James. If it wasn't, I wouldn't be calling you at this time."
"I'll be there in a tick," said James. "Get dressed into something warm. It's quite nippy out there tonight. It might be spring, but let me tell you, the nights are still hanging on to the dredges of winter."
I sighed with relief to hear James's reassuring voice. James always seemed to magnanimously put a band-aid onto the open grazes, cuts and cock-ups that I made of my own life. He made it all better. He'd always been so faithful to me in our long-standing friendship, and was never afraid to be brutally honest with me, even if it cost me a few knocks and shocks. But that's what I liked about him. James did not tell me what I wanted to hear, but he always told me what I needed to hear. Sometimes it wasn't pretty. I'd grown up in Spokane, Washington, and had lived next door to James, in a stunning, beautiful green leafy neighborhood. We'd been the best of friends forever and a day. Since we were tiny tots, we'd ridden our tricycles down the sidewalk, sprayed each other with water pistols, bounded around each other's backyards, getting up to all kinds of mischief with the garden hose, climbing trees and playing cops and robbers together. I'd been the quintessential tomboy in those days, and the best compliment James ever gave me growing up was that sometimes he completely forgot that I was a girl. We had been there for each other through thick and thin, and regarded each other as both brother and sister. In the beginning, when boyfriends of mine over the years had met James, they had not liked the close relationship I had with him, and felt rather threatened by it. They couldn't believe I'd be close to someone of the opposite sex platonically, but we really were the very best of friends, with no romantic leanings towards each other, and we both liked it that way. For a long time our parents thought we'd end up getting married, but we were always much better off as friends. When I needed a soft place to cushion the blows of my life, James would be there for me. He would be the first person I would turn to. I hadn't even told him about my engagement to Victor yet. Somehow everything had lost its rosy glow. after I'd got myself into such a dreadful mess. Before long I found myself sinking into the fabulously comfortable leather seats of James's SUV. I could smell the leather, along with the lingering scent of the essential oil diffuser that was dangling from his visor mirror. It smelt of lemon. It was all I could do not to burst into tears and cry my heart out into James's shoulders. I grimaced and bit my lip rather awkwardly as we drove through the bright lights of town, down the familiar grey ribbons of asphalt. We said nothing for a long while. James intuitively sensed I didn't want to talk. Well, not yet. He knew we needed to get far away from the bright, intrusive, rather blinding lights of the town that always gave me the nagging impression that burning eyes and listening ears were eavesdropping on our conversation. Soon James began to take narrow turns down sequestered, lonely dirt roads that had abandoned all their street lights, so that it was only the light of James's headlight that lit up the path ahead of us. Everything around us was swaddled by the twilight hours. The wheels of James's SUV thumped rather awkwardly over the craggy dips and rocky crevices in the road, while tiny pebbles pinged against his undercarriage. I could see the familiar, dense, rugged silhouettes of the countryside. The road we were on was once known as the Pilgrim's Way, and I came here often enough if I was feeling down in the dumps, and would thoroughly enjoy taking a long leisurely walk through the tall congregation of trees. The area boasted long, narrow hiking trails that were suitable for an ATV or bicycle, but certainly not a car. On the left-hand side of the road was a meadow filled with alpine flowers and sculptural rocky outcrops, and with a soft scattering of pearly moonlight that danced over the meadow, it was almost outer-worldly, which was oddly tranquilizing for me. James pulled his car up onto the side of the dirt road. Parking under a couple of tall oak trees, he killed his engine. He then turned around to look at me soberly.
"Spill, Pamela. What on earth is going on with you? How can I help you if you remain mute like this? We're away from the town. Tell me what's up. Anyone can see you're in quite the state," he said, studying me curiously. "Do you know you're wearing your sweater inside out?"
"Oh, I am," I said nonchalantly. "That's supposed to be lucky, isn't it?" I said, glancing down at my sweater. "I don't know what to say, James. I just want to look at the stars and the moon. It's beautiful out there tonight, isn't it?"
"Well, it is a lovely night, Pammy. But what's not lovely is to see the state you're in. Your face is white. You look as if you're quite green at the gills."
"Thanks for that. I do feel rather sick, I have to admit."
"So what's up then?"
"Last night Victor asked me to marry him."
"He what? He asked you to marry him?" James chuckled. "Oh, my God! You brought me out here to tell me that? I thought you had something bad to convey. You're getting married. That's fabulous news, isn't it?" he said, reaching out to give me a hug. "That's amazing, Pammy. Congratulations. Phew, I'm relieved. For a moment I thought something dreadful had happened. Why the hangdog expression after news like that? You'd think you'd be over the moon, but you look anything but."
"I have got bad news to convey. Very bad news."
"Oh, my God, you haven't, have you? You've broken up with Victor. You've declined his offer of marriage. I thought you wanted to marry him. What brought this on? I thought you said you were in love with the man. You were certain he was the one. Why this change of heart all of a sudden?"
"You've got it all wrong. I am in love with him. He is the one I want to marry," I said, stretching out my finger to show James my engagement ring.
"It's beautiful, Pammy,"
he said, taking my hand and examining my ring closely. He looked up at me in bemusement.
"What the hell is going on, Pammy? You've got engaged. You're very happy about it. But you look as miserable as if someone has hit you across the head with a pickaxe. Forgive me if I'm not getting something here, but I'm a tad confused. What is actually going on?"
"I drank last night. French champagne, topped up with tequilas. I became completely inebriated. You know how bad I get when I drink too much."
James sighed. I know how bad you get, only too well, Pammy. It's not pretty. Let me guess. Victor didn't like how you became when you drink. Is that it? Big deal, for goodness sake. A lot of people go a little, you know, over the top when they drink. What's his problem? He didn't like it, is that what you're going to tell me?
It isn't that, I said, my voice going flat. I was, you know, drinking last night. We were celebrating our engagement. Even my mother was in on the whole plan. Victor prepared me the most amazing dinner. It was ever so romantic. He went to so much trouble on my account.
Well, it sounds lovely. Why are you complaining?
It was lovely. It was better than lovely. But you know how I become, James, when I start to drink. My thirst for alcohol becomes insatiable. We had drunk all the alcohol in our house. I remembered there was a bottle of French champagne in the car, which had been given to me by my mother. I guess she knew that I was going to celebrate our engagement, which was why she gave me the champagne in the first place. We had already drunk far too much. I went to the parking bay to pick up the champagne in the trunk of my car. I was completely bladdered by this stage. The long and the short is, I woke up this morning in a strange bed in someone else's apartment.
What the hell do you mean?
Said James, his body tensing and his back straightening up.
What the hell do you mean, Pammy?
Exactly what I said, James. I thought I was in my apartment, but then I realized I was in somebody else's apartment, and that the man behind the comforter was not Victor. It was Ian Fleming.
Oh, my God,
said James, looking aghast, his eyes growing wide in horror.
You slept with the stranger last night? You have no memory of the event?
Pretty much, I said, dipping my head in shame. If you must know, Ian Fleming told me that I threw myself at him. He thought all his Christmases had come at once. He thought I was genuinely into him. I don't think he realized quite how drunk I was, although he did say I passed out quite quickly on his bed. There was a silence in the car when James assimilated all my words.
So have you told Victor any of this? He must have wondered where you got to last night, when you went off to get the French champagne and never returned.
He doesn't have a clue. He passed out on the couch. I found him there this morning, so he has no idea. James chewed his lip uncomfortably.
Did I not say, Pammy, that you should never, ever drink again? Look what a complete mess you've got yourself embroiled in. This is completely crazy. As you know, I believe in honesty in relationships, but this, I'm not sure how honest you should be about this. I don't know how your fiancé is going to take it when you tell him you trotted off to the parking bay to retrieve your mother's French champagne, only to wake up in a stranger's bed. It would be hilariously funny if it wasn't so tragic.
So you think I shouldn't tell Victor what happened? How can I live with this guilty conscience, knowing what I did?
I'm not sure whether you should tell him, Pammy. It's not exactly an auspicious start to your engagement, is it? Sometimes it's best to let sleeping dogs lie, and not to say a word. Just move on with your life, pretending it never happened. One thing that I think is blindingly clear, Pammy, you must never ever drink again. I need to think about this long and hard. You aren't wrong when you say you've got yourself embroiled in a pickle. This is worse than I envisaged it would be. Do you mind awfully if I smoke?
I didn't know you smoked, James, I asked incredulously.
I don't, but I do now, said James, retrieving some cigarettes and a lighter from the cubbyhole in his car. These aren't mine. They're Kurt's, but right now I need something to steady my nerves.
I didn't smoke either, but a cigarette seemed like a rather good idea. Give me one too, I said. We were both coughing and spluttering as we inhaled the cigarette smoke, our indignant lungs protesting. But it was soothing holding a cigarette in my hands, and it seemed to steady my nerves. For a moment we sat there in silence, not saying a single word, and just continued to smoke. All of a sudden, we observed the most bizarre thing. There were flashes of strange lights coming from the woodgrove. It looked like a car headlights in the middle of the trees.
"What the hell is that?"
James asked me, pointing towards the trees.
"It looks like the headlights of a car, but there is no way a car can possibly fit into that tight cluster of trees. The footpath there is far too narrow."
Then we heard a thunderous crash, the sounds of wheels skidding across tarmac, glass shattering, and a horn going off. It sounded like a catastrophic car accident, when a car drives through an obstacle, like a tree.
"Bloody hell," said James. "Did you hear that?"
The sound was horrific. It made me squeeze my eyes tightly shut, for it was the kind of vision that invited in your mind images of death with buckled metal and blood everywhere. I was certain that someone must be seriously hurt, or worse still, dead. What happened next was even more baffling and bewildering. I opened my eyes, and that was when we saw an ambiguous female figure running through the groves towards our car. She was waving at us earnestly, flagging us down to get our attention. As she got close to us, I noticed she was wearing a white sweatshirt which said "Time After Time" by Cyndi Lauper, and a pair of jeans. I'd heard of that song before, but I was sure it was a very old song from the 80s. Her puffed-up, wild brown frizzy hair was flat on one side. Her face was badly congealed with blood, and there was blood spatter all over her sweatshirt. Oh, my God! The poor woman's been in a dreadful accident. She looks so disorientated.
"Do you need any help?"
asked James, pulling down his window to address the woman. The woman had been pointing to the woods, mouthing the words "help, help." James was about to ask her what the problem was, but then she completely vanished.
"Where did she go?" asked James,
turning to me, looking bewildered. "I don't know," I said. "She must have run back into the trees, gone back to the scene of the accident. She must be terribly concussed."
"But I don't understand," said James. "There is no conceivable way that a car can possibly fit through those trees. An ATV, a bicycle, absolutely, but not a car."
"I think there's a road on the other side of those trees, if my memory serves me well. It was used a lot in the olden days. That's where the accident must have occurred, and we heard it. I think that poor injured lady ran through the trees to see if she could get help on this road, thinking it was likely a busier road. She might find someone who could help her. Maybe her cell phone has been damaged in the crash. She certainly was trying to get our attention. I know she was. I could swear she was saying, 'Help me, help me,' and then she just vanished." That seemed like a plausible explanation to me, as the horrifying smashing sound we had heard of buckling metal was clearly a car colliding into a tree on an opposite road. Someone must be very badly hurt and in urgent need of medical attention. "You saw how befuddled she looked. I think she ran back to the scene of the accident to help out the injured party. Maybe she believes we're calling the emergency services now that we've physically seen her in her distress." We both climbed out of the car, and James wrestled around in the glove compartment to look for a torch.
"You go after the girl,"
he said, thrusting a medical emergency kit in my hand.
"See if you can go to the scene of the accident and give them as much help as they need. I'll catch up with you in a minute. I'm just going to call 911. Call me on your cell phone when you find her and the car."
With James's torch in my hand, I hurriedly scampered through the trees, and I don't mind admitting that I was not terribly confident. The girl could be anywhere in here, and where was this mysterious road I was looking for? It had to be somewhere through the trees. I do remember seeing a road once, when I went for a walk in here, but it was a long time ago, and I couldn't remember exactly where it was. I'm not the kind of person that appreciates the dark at the very best of times, but I sternly reminded myself that there were people who were in serious trouble, who were in desperate need of my help, and may potentially have life-threatening injuries. I couldn't afford to be squeamish about the dark. I did not doubt for a second that there had been a catastrophic accident of some kind on the opposite side of the trees. The wind whistled through the trees, the boughs of the trees swaggered like inebriated drunks, and occasionally branches brushed against me like ghostly disembodied hands, nudging me to get my attention, which was a very creepy feeling at this late hour of the night, but I wisely chose to ignore it. After all, these people needed my help. I couldn't entertain my fears. Then I saw the girl again, bounding through the trees. Her back was facing away from me. I ran after her, calling after her, "Please stop! Let me help you! Please let me help you! I think you've been in an accident." Yet again, the elusive girl appeared to have vanished. Where the hell did she go? And what on earth was she doing? Damn, I thought, feeling increasingly frustrated. "Excuse me," I called after her again, trying to step up my speed. But I was met with a stiff, uncongenial silence. Even the crickets and frogs were mute, and the only sound I heard was the rustling sound of the leafy boughs, the whistles of the wind, and my own feet moving very fast, beating against the soft earthen floor. What happened next was I went flying precariously off my feet, as a gnarled pair of roots that I'd failed to see before it was too late, that pierced obtrusively through the ground, tripped me up. For a second I was airborne. Then I was flung violently down a 50-foot drop that at one point I suspect had been an old mining shaft. We had many of these mining shafts in Spokane, Washington, but I ended up on the ground in this deep hollow, surrounded by a thicket of rambling vines, a plethora of fallen tree branches, and hundreds of leaves. And after my fall, I heard some rats scuttling away, as if my swift descent to the ground had scared the bejesus out of them. It certainly had done that to me. Thankfully I'd landed on a soft mattress of leafy mulch and forest debris that cushioned the blow of my fall. But an excruciating pain shot through my right leg. I glanced down at the leg in question and saw a protruding branch that I had fallen on had impaled my leg. I was absolutely terrified as I stared down at my leg, unable to believe what had happened. My heart was pounding violently in my chest, with a very intense adrenal response that possibly helped alleviate some of the pain. My torch had fallen an arm's length away from me, and had lit up the entire square hole of this old shaft. I was too numb to call or cry out, or even scream. I knew that if this tree branch was pulled out of my leg, I'd more than likely bleed to death. How the hell was I going to get out of this particular shaft? Tears began to spill down my cheeks, and I whimpered like a frightened dog. I so wanted to call out to James for help, but really I was unable to scream. A dark, shadowy figure was peering down at me from the top of the shaft. That was when I saw a pair of bright yellow eyes. What the hell was that, I wondered? The yellow eyes went away. I fumbled around for my cell phone in my back pocket of my jeans, but it had gone. It must have fallen out of my pocket. I heard two voices having a discussion together. They were speaking in a strange language and sounded very concerned, but this was a language I did not understand. I sighed with relief. That must be the emergency services. They had arrived in the woodgrove. They'd likely help me if they heard me, but their language was very bizarre. I had no idea from what part of the world they came from. "Help!" I called out. "Help! I'm down here! I'm down here!" The next thing I know is I heard something climbing down the mining shaft, and then I saw the ambiguous figure standing before me, caught up in the full light of my torch. I was astonished. This was not a human being that I was staring at, but a massive 10-foot-tall burly Bigfoot. Now I was convinced that I must have hit my head very hard and was seeing things. I was delusional. The creature stared at me, observing the long, jagged stick that had impaled my upper leg. The expression on his face grew gravely concerned and very troubled. He scratched his head as his eyes darted from my face to my legs. He appeared to be thinking, and even rubbed his chin, as if in thoughtful contemplation. He began to speak to me in a strange language. "Manikali na kwa, hom sashi sana,
Hoba kikakwina, halina stilanika, zalinika omokola sikwashana.
When he spoke to me, for some bizarre reason, I understood every word.
It's all right. I've got you. My name is Zelinka. We need to keep that stick in your leg, or you will bleed out, and that will kill you. Your people will know exactly what to do. I will get you out of this drop safely.
He then picked me up, as if I was just a feather, and climbed stealthily up the 50-foot drop with me and the piece of timber that had impaled me, completely secure in my leg. Before I knew it, he was laying me down gently on the ground. I could hear James's voice calling out to me in the woodgrove,
Pammy, Pammy, where are you? Help is coming, the Bigfoot told me. I'll leave you be. Masikana, hola shakanikwa.
Please, please don't go. I begged him, please don't leave me on my own. I didn't want to be left alone, but the Bigfoot gave me an apologetic look.
Bakikwaka, hopasakanasha, holakinakwa. I don't like to be seen by your kind, he explained. Masilo.
I'm sorry. I nodded, and the creature stealthily slunk away, before I had a chance to even say thank you. When James reached me, there was relief on his face.
Thank God I found you! What's happened to you? What's happened to your leg?
He was followed by a couple of EMTs. When the EMTs saw that I'd been impaled, they immediately got me back to the ambulance at record speed. Everything was such a foggy blur, as a needle was plunged into my arm. What about the accident? I blurted out. A woman is badly hurt on that road through the trees. She's got blood all over her face. You need to help her.
Calm down. Everything is fine, young lady. An EMT is checking the grove to be sure there isn't an accident, but I don't believe there is one. Unfortunately, you're not the first to have reported an accident occurring in that grove of trees. In the 1980s, a car barreled into a tree on the other road. The events keep being replayed in our time. We've been called out a few times to that scene, with the same bizarre reports of a woman wearing a Cindy Lauper sweatshirt with time after time written on it. I think you must have seen her ghost.
I also saw a Bigfoot, I told him. I fell down a mining shaft. He rescued me.
You're delirious, I was told,
as I was placed in a trolley and squirreled into the back of the ambulance. The only thing I remember is the EMT's voices and the sound of the ambulance siren blaring through the streets. Then everything blacked out for me, and beyond that I have no recall whatsoever. The next thing I remember being consciously aware of was the sound of faraway, very indistinct voices in the background. And then the voices appeared to get nearer and nearer. I think she's waking up. Someone was saying, Can you see her eyelids are fluttering? That's a very, very good sign. I could feel someone squeezing my hand, and then I heard my mother's voice. Pamela! Pamela, dear, can you hear me, love? It's your mother. I felt as if I was being caught up in a long, dark tunnel. I was dragging a sleeping bag in my hands across a concrete floor. I was holding my old stuffed teddy bear, Pinocchio, that accompanied me wherever I went when I was a child. I even took him to all my routine dental checkups and asked the dentist to check out my teddy bear's teeth. And he would always give my teddy bear's teeth a clean bill of health.
That bear of yours has no fillings to speak of, he would say. He rarely looks after his teeth very well.
That's 'cause he brushes his teeth with lots and lots of honey, I would say, and the dentist would laugh. I glanced down at the pyjamas I was wearing. They were pink and covered in little bears. I moved towards the voices. I was so lost in that dark void and desperate to get to my mother. But the tunnel was so long, and I was so scared, as there was water at my feet, and ivy growing all over the tunnel, along with a plethora of fallen leaves that clung to the floor in clumps. Then I saw the yellow eyes again, and this time they brought me comfort. They stared at me reassuringly through the darkness, and spoke to me in the strange language that suddenly changed to English in my head.
Kolatanaqua, hilasinaqua, hilivologobalashani, soshaqua. You know you can do it. Just go to the voices. Don't be afraid.
So I obeyed those eyes and moved towards the voices, pulling back the dark veil when I reached the end of the tunnel. And then I heard my mother's excited voice. "Oh, my God! I do believe she's waking up." Then I heard Victor's distinct voice. He was talking to my father.
"Do you think she'll know who we are when she wakes up?"
Then there was an authoritative female voice. "She didn't hit her head. Her leg was impaled. She'll definitely know who you are. Don't worry about that."
"Thank God," said Victor. "That's a relief. I'd hate her to forget who we are, and especially me, because we're getting engaged. Imagine if she forgot we were engaged. Oh, my God, I think she's coming round. She's opening her eyes."
One of my eyes popped open, and then another. I felt so groggy, so disorientated, rather confused. "Pamela, it's me, darling. It's your mother. How are you feeling? You gave us quite a shock, you did." I sat up awkwardly in my bed, noticing the drip attached to my arm. "Where am I?" I asked, as I saw my father, my mother, Victor and James all staring down at me, with earnest looks on their faces. "You're in hospital, darling. You've had an operation. You impaled your leg on a branch. How are you feeling? It was so lucky that branch was left in your leg. You could have died. Do you remember what happened?"
Oh, yes, I do remember. The mine shaft. I fell down a mine shaft. It was about 50 foot deep.
"You didn't fall down a mine shaft," said James, correcting me. "Don't you remember what happened? I found you on the forest floor. You must have tripped over a root or something and impaled your leg in a tree branch."
"No, I fell down a mine shaft. The Bigfoot rescued me."
I could see 4 pairs of bemused eyes glancing at each other, as if to say, "She may have impaled her leg, but I think she's hallucinating as well. I think she's a bit delirious and seeing erroneous things that aren't actually there." My mother whispered. But I knew in that poignant moment that my memory had never been more sharp. But I decided talking about seeing a fallacious, idiosyncratic thing like a Bigfoot would make my family firmly believe that I was suffering from some kind of head injury. So I decided to wisely keep stum. Several days later, "I'm looking forward to the celebratory lunch with my mother," I said to my fiancé Victor, grabbing his hand and giving it an affectionate squeeze. I was physically doing so much better after my rather harrowing operation, and although the site of my impalement was badly bruised, the medical team had done a superb job in stitching me up. I was on antibiotics and painkillers and was doing remarkably well. At one point in the operation, I had lost a lot of blood during the tricky part of the procedure, when the surgeon had very carefully removed the branch from my leg, which was quickly replaced with all the donated blood on standby. If indeed the branch had been removed from my leg in the woods, I wouldn't have stood a chance of survival. It still ached to walk, and I was hobbling around awkwardly with a crutch, but beyond that, I was doing remarkably well. My mother had invited me and Victor to lunch to celebrate our engagement, and James had obviously been invited to the lunch as well. Victor had never been comfortable about my close relationship with my childhood friend, but he had learned to accept that I viewed James like a brother.
"I'm glad things are finally settling down, especially after your accident. My, what a week that was. Who would have thought the week that I proposed to you? Everything goes awry," Victor told me in the car. "You've been quite peaky for a while. I've been rather worried about you. But I'm glad that there's a distinct pink colour in your cheeks again. Thank God everything is finally sorting itself out. And then there's my brother. He's made up with his girlfriend. They're now engaged to be married. And at this rate, they might actually beat us down the aisle. I think things are going to work out very favourably for them. Those two were always meant to be together. I mean, all relationships have hiccups, do they not?" "But of course," I said.
That's life. Relationships have hiccups. That's a guarantee.
Well, at least you're healing superbly from your impalement. You scared the hell out of me, babe. Don't ever do that to me again. I thought I'd lost you. I really did. You have still not told me why the hell you were in that wood grove that night with James, and how you ended up being impaled by that branch. You've been very vague and very insouciant about all the details. James hasn't exactly been forthcoming either.
All will be revealed at lunch, I assured him, my leg trembling nervously. Victor did not know that one of the reasons why James was coming to lunch with us was that I wanted to get everything out in the open. I was done with all the secrets, and I told Victor as much.
You're done with all the secrets? That sounds ominous to me, said Victor,
glancing at me through narrowing eyes, when we rounded the bend and drove up the small red brick driveway to my parents' front door. The door burst open, and there was my mother, looking like she'd been on a holiday to the Maldives, as the dark circles of worry that had plastered themselves unwillingly on her face since she'd learnt of my impalement had thankfully faded, and her sunken cheeks that had weathered a few days of failing to eat had subsequently filled out. My mother's blue eyes, framed by a brand new pair of sophisticated purple-rimmed glasses, were wearing an expression of relief, as if she was viewing the sun bursting through the clouds after a thunderous storm.
"Oh, it is so good to see you, Pammy,"
said my mother, throwing her arms very carefully around me, as if she thought I was so fragile that I might just suddenly break.
"How are you feeling, my love?"
"I'm hurting a lot on the leg that was impaled. I've got a slight limp, but the painkillers are working a treat. It's when they wear off. The pain can be quite explosive at times."
"Well, it will get better. I'm sure of that, my darling. These things take time to heal,"
she said reassuringly, sounding as comforting as raindrops falling down on a tin roof.
"In many ways, dear, you need to be thankful for the impalement. It acted as a plug on your leg. If you had bled out, you know what the surgeon said. You'd have been dead in minutes." "Please don't say that," said Victor. "It scares the hell out of me to think that I could have lost my fiancée. But you haven't, and she's here, right as rain, and she's going to make a full recovery. So we have so much to celebrate at lunch today. Would you please come in? We definitely need to open the champagne. None for me, Mum. I think I'm going to quit drinking for good." "Oh, well, that just means more for the rest of us, doesn't it? Now I want to show you something, my love. Something that's going to startle you somewhat. I don't think you're going to be best pleased, but so what? I decided I was going to make some changes."
My mother led me into her living room, and I gasped. My mother began to giggle like a schoolgirl, pointing her finger at me. My father bellowed with laughter, and then I smiled.
"I thought you were winding me up about painting the living room orange. But you've actually gone and done it."
My mother's face twinkled like a bright star.
"Do you know what, Pammy? After the horror of your impalement, I returned home one night to our white dowdy walls, and I knew we needed to do something to bring some colour into our lives. I decided to blow caution to the wind. I told your father to go and buy some orange paint, and he could select the exact shade of orange that he liked, and we would paint our living room, and the hell with it. And I want to tell you, I am thrilled with the result. I can hardly believe it. What do you think?"
I drew in a deep breath and said, "Do you know what, Mum? I love it.
I thought that this colour choice would be appalling, but the living room, it looks so cheerful." "I love it too," said my mother. "I'm so glad you love it, Pammy, because I tell you, the moment we put that orange on the wall, I felt so much more positive and upbeat about life. I know exactly what Pierre White was talking about in his book on interior design. I bought some colourful throws, as you can see, and some cushions. And look, it just looks fabulous. You might even think I was in Marrakesh right now."
It certainly looks vibrant, Mum, and I honestly take my words back. It looks superb.
You're not the only one who thinks so, my love. Mrs. Bailey from next door has copied us to a T. She's only gone and painted her living room the exact same shade of orange, and it looks swell. She's over the moon.
Who knows, Mum? You might have started a brand new fashion trend. Next, the articles in the Daily Herald will read, Marrakesh invades neighbourhood in Spokane. At that, we all chuckled, and my mother led us into the dining room. I gasped as I stared at the table that was set for 5 people, with gleaming silverware and a large bouquet of roses in the centre of the table. Mum, the table looks exquisite.
Well, it's not every day. Your daughter gets engaged. Nor is it every day a child of yours survives a leg impalement, said my mother. So today we've got so much to celebrate, especially the 2 of you coming together. I am so delighted about your engagement.
My mother bustled around as everyone chatted cheerfully between delicious mouthfuls of my mother's mouth-watering light and fluffy cheese soufflé that was served with salad for starters. It was absolutely delicious. After the amazing first course was complete, I raised my hand and told everyone that James and I had a story to share, so the table became silent, as all the eyes were now focused on me. James and I have got something to tell you, something that I need to get off my chest, and it certainly concerns you, Victor. I cannot go into our marriage with any skeletons in my cupboard, so I'm going to tell you because I love and respect you, and because I don't want any secrets between us.
You really don't need to tell me, said Victor. Whatever it is, it's in the past. We can move on.
I reached out to squeeze Victor's hand. Remember when we were celebrating our engagement? He nodded. I told you I needed to go to the car to get my mother's French champagne.
That's right, Victor chuckled. I couldn't believe it. You were so bladdered. But no, you still wanted more drink. Mind you, I wasn't much better myself.
James interceded.
I'm afraid that is what Pammy's like when it comes to alcohol. She's like a kid in a candy shop, grabbing every available sweetie on offer when she can barely stand. That's why I told her she needed to quit drinking. You'll notice she hasn't had any alcohol today. There's some people that just can't drink, and Pammy is one of those people.
Anyway, Victor, when I went down to the car to retrieve the French champagne, I was completely bladdered. I woke up the following morning in a stranger's apartment, naked in their bed. It was Ian Fleming's apartment. You know the one. There was a solemn silence around the table, as all eyes widened, and my mother was so shocked she cupped her hands over her mouth. Well, at first I thought that Victor had done some major home improvements to our bathroom, but then I realised the figure in the bed next to me was Ian Fleming, the guy in our apartment block. He claimed I'd thrown myself at him, but I have no memory of the event. I'm so sorry, Victor. I don't know what to say. I honestly am so ashamed. I would never have done this if I hadn't been so drunk. Victor's face went from ashen to white to purple.
That man, he growled. He should have seen you were blind drunk. He took complete advantage of you, not the other way round. That really sucks, Pammy. I'm sorry I wasn't there to rescue you.
Victor, I'm sorry. I shouldn't have, been persuaded by this man. I have no idea what happened. Why aren't you mad with me? I was the one that made this dreadful blunder.
No, I'm not mad at you. I'm mad at myself. I should never have let you go to the car in your inebriated state. But I guess I was almost as plastered as you. I also blame Ian Fleming. I'm sorry, but he should have known you were intoxicated. But let's move on from here, shall we? All is forgiven and forgotten. Let's say no more about it.
Oh dear, said my mother, dabbing her mouth with her napkin. I should never have given you that bottle of French champagne. Then none of this would have happened.
Goodness gracious me. You do have to be so careful when you drink, Pammy. You can't let that happen again.
I told you, Mum. I'm never going to drink again. Oh, well, I think it's just as well, dear. I don't like the idea of you making a dreadful mistake like this again. It's absolutely awful to think you have no memory of the event. It scares the bejesus out of me.
I think we can safely say, said my father, that Pammy here has learnt a lesson. She's decided she'll never drink again. Now I think we just need to draw a line under the sand and move on with our lives. We don't need to dwell on this mistake. Things like this happen. But as you can see, Victor is a very reasonable man, and I'm very delighted he's marrying our daughter.
You told us, sweetheart, that you were going to tell us why you got impaled, said my mother. Well, I said, clearing my throat awkwardly. As you know, I was so devastated about what had transpired waking up in Ian Fleming's apartment that I phoned up James over here. James is so reliable. I always turn to him when I am in trouble. Anyway, we went for a drive in the countryside to Pilgrim's Way, and that's when I told him what I'd done. And I was asking him for advice about whether I should tell Victor about my great big blunder, or whether it would just upset him too much.
Of course you should tell me, Pammy, said Victor, reaching out to squeeze my hand again. In marriage you have to get over your hiccups. We were discussing that in the car earlier. You should know. You must never ever keep anything from me again.
I won't. I promise you I won't. Thank you so much, Victor.
Don't thank me. It is what it is. That's what relationships are about.
Well, aren't we going to talk about what happened when my daughter got impaled? Please carry on with the story. Well, when we were sitting in the car together, talking, we heard the most dreadful calamitous sound. It scared the hell out of me. It sounded like a car was smashing directly into a tree. We heard it skidding as if it was on tarmac, and then we heard the loud thrashing sound. We saw headlights flashing through the trees. And then we saw this strange girl wearing a sweatshirt with a logo on it, Time After Time, by Cyndi Lauper. She had long frizzy brown hair that I think was a crimp perm or something, and her head was congealed on one side with so much blood. And there was blood spatter all over her shirt. It was quite frightening to see. She was beckoning to us, begging us for help. I think she was saying, "Help me, help me." I was reading her lips, you see. She then just vanished, disappeared from our sight. James hurriedly called the emergency services, gave me his medical aid kit and a torch, and I ran through the trees to see if I could help the girl. We assumed there was a road through the trees where someone had had a catastrophic accident. We were quite sure we were going to see some serious injuries there. My mother let out an audible gasp. She raised her hand. "Please, none of you say another word, will you? I've got something to show you all, and I think it concerns exactly what my daughter is telling you right now. Believe it or not, I know all about that accident. A lot of people heard about that accident in the 1980s. It didn't happen recently. It happened a long time ago. Believe me, I know the story." My mother hurriedly returned to the table. She flicked through her old photograph album from when she was a teenager in the 1980s. She brought out a picture of 3 girls wearing identical sweaters with Time After Time on them by Cyndi Lauper, and the girl in the middle of the picture was the girl I'd seen beckoning to us in the woods, asking for help. "You see this girl here, who died so tragically. She was my very best friend, you know. It's a very, very sad story. You're not the first person to have seen her ghost, my love. I assume that is what you saw." "It is the girl I saw, and that was exactly the same sweater that she was wearing. She must have died pretty soon after this photograph. She did, I'm afraid. I think it was a week later, if I'm right. That girl was just such a delightful girl. Her name was Sandy McGovern. I believe you must have seen her ghost. You aren't the first, nor are you the last. We brought those sweaters as we loved that song Time After Time in the 1980s. It was a very popular song back then, I hasten to say. but I must say I haven't heard it being played in recent years." "Well, the ambulance told us exactly the same thing, Mum. They claim that other people have seen Sandy McGovern's ghost, begging for help at the very late hours of the night. They think the dramatic scene of her death is being played out again and again in our time-space."
"It is extraordinary,"
said my mother, thrusting a newspaper article into my hand, which I read to everyone. 15-year-old Sandy McGovern and her boyfriend, 16-year-old Warren Becker, were tragically involved in a head-on collision on a small road opposite the Pilgrim's Way on Friday, June the 5th, 1985, when Warren Becker lost traction on the road and drove head-first into a powerful tree. The car was a complete write-off. The parents of both teenagers were mortified to discover that in the dead of night, Sandy McGovern had crept out of her home to meet up with her boyfriend Warren Becker. Both kids had been drinking heavily. As post-mortem results reveal, their blood alcohol levels were way above the legal limit, and there was evidence of empty bottles of rum and coke on the back seats of the car. Why their car plunged into a tree on that back road is unknown, but family and friends are devastated about the sudden passing of two much-loved members of the community. "My God! We did see her ghost! We saw her ghost, James! Can you believe it?"
"I can believe it, although she certainly did not look like a ghost. She looked as real as you or me."
I proceeded to tell everyone how I'd ended up falling 50 feet into an old mine shaft and how my leg had got impaled.
"But I don't understand, love," said my father. "The emergency services did not find you in a shaft. You were discovered on flat ground. James found you himself."
"That's because a very large Bigfoot rescued me from that mine shaft. He spoke to me in a very strange language that I couldn't understand, that was miraculously translated in my head in English. He made it very clear that he was going to carry me out of the shaft and lay me safely on the ground. He was careful to leave the branch in my leg. He told me that if he pulled it out, that I would die. He knew about the consequences of having an injury like that. He said I needed to wait for help and that he didn't want to be seen by any of our kind. He was so intelligent, I can't tell you. And he was real. There is no way these creatures are fictitious. I saw him myself."
"I'm sure you're mistaken," said my father. "You had a bad fall. You were probably hallucinating. That's what it was."
"She wasn't hallucinating," said James, as all eyes turned to focus on him.
"After everything that happened, I need to tell you all that I returned to the Woodgrove myself. When Pammy told me she'd fallen down a 50-foot mine shaft and a Bigfoot had rescued her, I thought I would investigate the Woodgrove myself in the daylight hours. Besides, my torch and medical bag were missing. I hoped I would be able to recover them. So I ventured into that Woodgrove. I didn't see any signs of a mine shaft at first. I was convinced that Pammy had had a fall and inadvertently bumped her head, suffering from some kind of delusion. I've heard about people talking about Bigfoot before, of course I have, but I never remotely believed such a fictitious creature could exist. But I also knew that Pammy has never once spoken to me about the cryptic creature before, so for her to randomly mention that she was rescued by such a thing seemed almost credible, because it was preposterous on her part for her to talk about such things. It was when I was ambling through the trees I came across a muddy path, and in that path I discovered a very sizable footprint in the mud that was so enormous it stole my breath away. I knew that that footprint was not made by a bear, so the only thing I could conclude was that it was made by a Bigfoot. As I continued to walk through the grove, I kept my eyes pinned on the ground, searching for this mine shaft, and that's when I discovered a danger sign and saw an area completely covered in ivy, and when I looked down, I saw a huge square dip in the ground, and a very large dip it was too. Pammy's right, it was about 50 foot deep, and at the bottom of all this ivy was my medical bag and my torch. So it's safe to say that Pammy's story was true. Pamela did fall down a shaft. I can tell you, that part of her story is correct.
My mother gasped. I can't believe it.
It gets better than that, said James, digging in his pocket to pull out a bright blue stone.
What's that?
I asked him. It's for you. It's from your friend, James told me. He asked me to give it to you. He hopes you're feeling a whole lot better. He says it will bring you good fortune.
Sorry, said my mother. You've lost me, James. Will you say that again? What friend are you talking about? Who gave Pammy that stone?
The Bigfoot, of course. Who do you think I was talking about?
You saw the Bigfoot? My mother asked. You can't have. You saw a Bigfoot.
I did indeed. I was standing over the mine shaft, staring into the hollow, when something began throwing pebbles at me. I stood very still, thinking, what the hell is that? And then a head peeped out from behind a tree. The Bigfoot was a little shy, rather elusive at first, but he said to me, "How is she, the girl that fell down that hole?" I said she was fine, thank you very much. Get this, he spoke to me in a strange language. I didn't understand the language, but I understood every word he spoke to me. "How extraordinary," said my father. "What did he look like?" "Well, his body shape was like a bullet. He was monstrously large. I think he was about 9 foot tall. He was huge in girth and stature and weight, with overlong arms and a powerful pair of legs. He moved very gracefully, I have to say. His face was remarkably human. He had a human symmetry, although his nose was flat, his cheekbones very high, and his forehead slightly protruding. But he was rather a handsome fella. He was covered in dark black hair that had a slight auburn hue when it was caught in the sun. "Wow, that's incredible," said my father. "I must admit, I am surprised. I really thought my daughter was hallucinating. But it seems, Pammy, that your story is completely credible. James has certainly validated it."
"Were you frightened of him, James?" my mother asked. James thought about my mother's question for a moment.
"You know what? I don't think I'd call my first impressions fear. I'd say I was more confounded, but very inquisitive and curious at the same time. It's like when you know you should not be seeing something that you're seeing, so you think for a moment that you must be dreaming. I guess I had to pinch myself a couple of times, but when I adjusted to what my eyes were beholding, I guess I just realized it was a Bigfoot. And of course his eyes just were so lovely. They were very kind, so I knew at once he was not dangerous."
"Why?" asked my mother. James shrugged his shoulders nonchalantly.
"I don't know. His eyes were very wise, and as I say, he was very benevolent. The creature spoke to me, and in that moment it seemed like the most natural thing in the world to be talking to a Bigfoot. It was like talking to any other human being. He handed me the stone to give to Pammy, and then nodded very politely and just glided away. I wish I could have spent more time with him, but he was reluctant to say very much. I stood there for a full 15 minutes after he'd gone, watching the insects buzzing around the plants, asking myself, did that just happen? Because when something like that happens, it's hard to believe it was real."
I studied the stone that I'd been given, which was passed around the table, with everyone going, "My God, that's incredible!" My mother suddenly gasped, "I'd forgotten! The roast lamb! It's in the oven! It might be getting burnt!" she said, dashing back to the kitchen. I held the stone in my hands, with a warm smile creeping up on my face. And I've got that stone now, made into a beautiful pendant, and I wear it all the time, and I believe it brings me luck wherever I go. I've been happily married to Victor now for 10 years. We have 2 little toddlers, and James is still one of my very best friends. So there you are. That's my story.
Wow, what an incredible story. My word, I can't imagine what it must be like to wake up in somebody else's apartment and you have no idea where you are. At first you think it's your own apartment, and then you realize, how did I get here? And it must be quite terrifying to have no memory
of why you're in that apartment. What an incredible story it was, and being able to see the ghost of someone who died so many years before, and to know that you'd actually witnessed that, and then to stumble down a mine shaft like that and impale your leg, and nobody believes your Bigfoot story until it's actually affirmed.
Well, hello there. I hope you enjoyed the Omnibus edition. We've got many more coming our way for you to listen to. Sending you love wherever you are in the world, in North America, Canada, Kenya, wherever you may be. I send you lots and lots of love. Thank you for listening to my Omnibus, and I really do hope you enjoyed it, because that's the whole idea about it, is to give you some interesting stories to listen to. So until next time, goodbye and good night.